When I woke up this morning, the moon was sitting at my kitchen table. Not a metaphorical moon or some artsy dream image, but the actual moon. Round, cratered, softly glowing. Perched on a chair too small for its size. My first thought was, I need more sleep. My second thought was, I don't own that chair. Good morning, the moon said. Its voice deep and resonant, like echoes in a canyon. Its face, if you could call it that, shifted subtly with each word, craters rearranging themselves into something approximating expressions. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, blinked again. The moon was still there, sipping from a coffee cup that hadn't been in my cupboard yesterday. Hi, I said, clutching the doorway like it might protect me from celestial bodies that had decided to drop by uninvited. The moon set the cup down gently. I was beginning to think you'd never wake up. Am I dreaming? I asked, because it felt like the most obvious explanation. No, said the moon, but I'm flattered you think of me at night. I squinted at it. I don't think about you. Yes, you do, it said, leaning slightly forward, glowing softly. You stared at me for 20 minutes last night. You don't remember? I frowned, trying to recall what I'd been doing before bed. It was a blur, brushing my teeth, scrolling through TikTok, pulling my curtains closed. Had I looked out the window? Maybe, but staring at the moon? That didn't sound like me. Why are you here? I asked finally. The moon tilted slightly, like it was weighing its words. Because you noticed. Noticed what? Everything, it said simply. Yeah, that's not cryptic at all, I muttered. Before the moon could respond, my cat, Juniper, sauntered into the kitchen and froze mid-step. Her fur puffed up like she'd just seen a ghost. Or, a giant glowing orb drinking coffee at her table. Oh, great, Juniper hissed, backing away. It's here. You know the moon? I asked, my voice rising in pitch. Juniper shot me a withering glare. Of course, I know the moon. Everyone knows the moon. But it's not supposed to be here. I was invited, the moon said coolly, craters rearranging themselves into what I assumed was a smug expression. By who? Juniper demanded. The moon turned its glowing gaze to me. I froze. Wait, me? I didn't invite. You opened the door, the moon interrupted. That's invitation enough. The door? Juniper groaned, leaping onto the counter. Oh, for crying out loud. This is why I told you not to leave your curtains open at night. What does that have to do with anything? Curtains are a boundary, Juniper explained, flicking her tail irritably. When you leave them open, it's like putting out a sign that says, "Come on in, weirdos." The moon chuckled. Smart cat. Thank you, Juniper said, preening slightly. I put my hands up. Okay, hold on. You're telling me I accidentally invited the moon into my house because I didn't close my curtains? Yes, they said in unison. That's insane. So is letting the stars watch you sleep, the moon replied. I had no idea what to say to that. The moon reached for its coffee cup again. Or maybe it just leaned toward it, since it didn't have arms. Anyway, it's not just about the curtains. It's the noticing. You've been looking, even if you don't realize it. And when someone like you starts looking, the rest of us start noticing back. I stared at it, heart pounding. The rest of us? The moon tilted its head, sphere, slightly. You think I came here alone? Before I could process that, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it instinctively, grateful for something normal, only to see that my screen was filled with tiny, glowing dots. Stars. My phone was filled with stars. The screen pulsed faintly, and a soft, melodic hum poured from the speaker. Not a ringtone, not static. A sound like singing, like constellations pressing their voices into my ears. They're saying hello, the moon said. Why is my phone full of stars? I asked, my voice shaky. It's not full, Juniper said, licking her paw. It's just connected. They're nosy, like that. I set the phone down carefully, as if it might explode. Okay, so, let me get this straight. I've accidentally invited the moon into my kitchen. My phone is apparently a star portal, and none of this is a dream? Correct, said the moon. Juniper yawned. Don't worry, It gets weirder. Weirder than this? I asked, gesturing wildly at the glowing orb sitting at my table. As if on cue, the ceiling cracked. Not in a normal, oh no, better call a contractor, kind of way. No, this crack was glowing, spilling silver light into the room as a single, delicate figure stepped through it. She was tall, slender, and shimmering, her body made entirely of light and shadow. Her eyes, if you could call them that, were galaxies swirling endlessly in their sockets. Luna, the figure said, addressing the moon. Her voice was soft, but it vibrated the air like the strings of a harp. You didn't tell me you'd arrived. The moon glowed slightly brighter, like it was blushing. Stella, I was just getting to it. I stared at the glowing woman, my mind blank. Who is that? Juniper sighed dramatically. That's Stella. She's technically a star, but don't say that out loud. She hates labels. The figure turned to me, her swirling eyes locking onto mine. And you, she said, her voice both gentle and overwhelming. You're the one who opened the door. I nodded dumbly. Good, she said, her light pulsing faintly. It's been too long since a human paid attention. To what? I whispered. To us, Stella replied. The sky, the stars, the stories written in the spaces between. Most of your kind stopped looking centuries ago. But you see. I shook my head. I don't see anything. You will, Stella said. She reached out, her glowing hand brushing the air in front of me. The question is, will you step through? Through? Juniper hopped onto the table, her tail curling around her paws. She's asking if you're ready to leave the surface behind. Go beyond what you know. Look past the curtains, the clouds, the edges of the universe. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. What happens if I say no? Nothing, the moon said simply. You go back to your life. Close your curtains. Pretend we were never here. And if I say yes? Stella smiled, her eyes burning brighter. Then the sky becomes yours. I stood there, my heart pounding, as stars whispered from my phone, and the moon waited patiently for my answer. And for once, I stopped thinking. I reached out and took Stella's hand. I was 9 years old the first time I heard about the Latchkey Man. It was on a dare, whispered to me by one of the older kids on the playground, who always smelled like melted crayons and told stories with too much detail to be entirely fake. His name was Matt, and when he pulled me aside that October afternoon, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial hush. Do you know about the Latchkey Man? No, I said, though I tried to sound like I didn't care. Good, Matt grinned, showing off the gap in his front teeth. You shouldn't. That was the thing about kids back then. If you shouldn't do something, you immediately had to. I pestered him until he told me everything. The Latchkey Man, Matt said, only came for you if you were alone. Latchkey kids, he explained, eyes wide. You know, the ones who go home to an empty house after school? He likes them because there's no one around to stop him. The Latchkey Man, as Matt told it, wasn't really a man at all. He was tall and thin like paper, thin enough to slip through cracks in doors or the gaps under windowsills. He always carried a ring of keys, but you'd never see him until it was too late. You'd hear him first, the jingling, keys rattling softly, just out of sight. And then he'd whisper your name, just once, just softly enough that you'd think you imagined it. Don't answer, Matt warned me, grabbing my wrist like he was trying to drill it into my bones. That's how he knows you're his. It was a good story, creepy enough to stick in your mind, vague enough that you filled in the blanks with your worst fears. I couldn't get the image of him out of my head, tall and silent, keys clinking as he slithered through empty houses, waiting. That night, I dreamed about keys. By the time I was 12, I didn't believe in the Latchkey Man anymore. I told myself I didn't believe, anyway. I was old enough to laugh at those stories and walk home by myself without getting nervous. My parents both worked late shifts, so every day after school, I'd let myself in with the spare key that hung from a chain around my neck, drop my bag by the door, and watch cartoons until dinner. I remember the day it happened perfectly because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were boring. It was late November, the sky gray and heavy, The kind of cold that feels like it's pressing against you, waiting to seep in through the cracks. I'd been home for about an hour when I heard it. Jingle. It was faint. Too faint. I muted the TV, suddenly very aware of how quiet the house was. I held my breath, straining to listen. Nothing. I told myself it had come from outside. A dog collar, maybe, or someone fumbling with their own keys down the street. But I couldn't shake that prickly feeling at the back of my neck, the sense that I wasn't really alone. I turned the TV back on and cranked up the volume. A minute later, I heard it again. Jingle. This time, it was closer. I looked toward the front door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But through the peephole, the porch was empty. I tried to ignore it, to blame it on my imagination. But the sound kept coming, soft, deliberate, and moving through the house. First by the front door, then by the kitchen, then closer. I grabbed the remote with white-knuckled hands and turned off the TV. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, but I held perfectly still, listening. And then, from just beyond the living room doorway, I heard it. Charlie. It was soft, like a breath. So quiet I almost convinced myself I'd misheard. My entire body went cold. I sat frozen on the couch, staring at the darkened doorway that led to the hall. Jingle. The sound of keys rattling gently, like someone was rolling them across their palm. It was closer now, just on the other side of the wall. I didn't move. Charlie, the voice whispered again, slower this time. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart pounding so hard I thought it would bruise my ribs. Don't answer, I told myself, over and over. Matt's voice echoed in my head. That's how he knows you're his. For a long time, nothing happened. I sat there, shaking, listening to the silence press in around me. And then I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of someone turning a key in the lock of the back door. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my mom's phone charger off the table. It was the only thing in reach, and bolted up the stairs, my socks sliding on the wooden floor. I didn't look back. I didn't dare look back. The sound followed me, the soft jingle of keys, the whisper of my name. I slammed my bedroom door, locked it, and threw myself into the closet, curling up in the corner with the charger wrapped tight around my fists like it would help. For what felt like hours, I sat there in the dark, biting down on my knuckles to keep myself from making a sound. My entire body was shaking, every nerve screaming for me to run, even though there was nowhere to go. The jingling grew louder. It came up the stairs, one step at a time, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the climb. Jingle. It stopped outside my bedroom door. And then I heard the soft metallic scrape of a key sliding into the lock. I don't remember what happened next. I don't remember screaming, though I must have, because the next thing I knew, my mom was shaking me awake. It was dark outside, and I was still huddled in the closet. Tears dried on my cheeks and the phone charger tangled around my hands. There's no one here, she said, though she looked rattled. The doors were locked. Charlie, you must have had a nightmare. I wanted to argue, to tell her about the whisper and the keys and the lock turning in the door. But when we walked downstairs together, I saw something that stopped me cold. The back door was wide open, and on the doormat lay a single, rusty key. I don't walk home alone anymore. Even as an adult, I take the bus, the train, anything to avoid the silence of an empty house. I don't let myself hear the quiet anymore, because I know he's still out there. Sometimes, when I'm in bed at night and the house is too still, I swear I hear it again. Jingle. Have you ever heard something you weren't supposed to? A sound so faint, so specific, it feels like it's meant just for you? Because if you do, don't answer it. Don't follow it. And whatever you do, don't let it find you alone. I first met myself on a Wednesday. A weird Wednesday, granted, but a Wednesday nonetheless. It was the middle of the afternoon, and I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop, sipping a chai latte that tasted slightly burnt, when the bell over the door jingled and I looked up. There I was, walking in. Me. Same black hoodie. Same scar over my left eyebrow. Same face that looked vaguely tired no matter how much sleep I got. At first, I thought it was some elaborate prank. Maybe a friend had hired a lookalike to mess with me. But then I watched as other me approached the counter, ordered the exact same chai latte I was drinking, and settled into the chair right across from me. I looked up and smiled, like this was perfectly normal. "Hi," he said. His voice sounded just like mine. "Mind if I sit here?" I stared at him, my brain flipping through every possible explanation, most of which involved hallucinations or a head injury I didn't remember getting. "You were sitting there," I said, "and you're me. So, yeah, I guess sit wherever you want." "Thanks," he said, pulling his chair closer. "I was hoping you'd be chill about this." "About what?" "Meeting yourself." The conversation might have ended there, me silently panicking while other me sipped his latte, except he leaned forward and whispered, "You're going to ask me the obvious question next, so let's just get it out of the way. I'm you, from a slightly different place. Let's call it a neighboring reality." I blinked at him. "Like an alternate universe?" "Basically. Parallel timeline. I'm almost you, but not quite." I laughed, because what else was I supposed to do? "Okay, and what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be off in your own timeline?" "Yeah, that's the thing," other me said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I need a favor." "A favor?" I repeated. "From me? The exact same person as you?" Other me nodded and took a long, unbothered sip of his chai. "Well, almost the same person. Like I said, there are slight differences." I squinted at him. "What kind of differences? Would it make you feel better or worse if I told you I was doing just a little bit better at life than you are?" "That's rude." "It's true," he said, shrugging. "But relax, I'm not here to gloat. I'm here because of a situation." "What kind of situation?" Other me paused and glanced around the coffee shop, as if to make sure no one was listening. Then he leaned in so close I could smell the same chai on his breath. "I lost something. Well, technically, I stole something I shouldn't have. And now, it's trying to follow me." I stared at him. "Follow you? What's following you?" He smiled tightly and sat back in his chair. "You're about to find out." I didn't get a chance to ask him what he meant, because that's when the lights flickered. All around the cafe, customers glanced up from their phones, confused. The barista muttered something about the power being weird lately, but other me just froze, staring at the window. Something was outside. At first, I couldn't see it clearly, just a shadow, dark and shifting, rippling across the sidewalk like a smudge of ink. But then it stopped. It gathered itself, standing up tall, and suddenly it wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a shape, a humanoid thing, too thin and too tall, its outline shimmering faintly, like it couldn't quite decide which reality it belonged to. Where its face should have been, there was only emptiness, a black void framed by jagged edges of light. And I swear I felt it looking at me. "Is that what's following you?" I hissed at other me, who was now gripping his chai latte like it was a lifeline. "Yeah," he whispered. "It's not friendly." The creature, or whatever it was, pressed a hand to the window. Its fingers were impossibly long, stretching outward, leaving a trail of frost on the glass as it started to push through. "Fix this," I shouted. Other me stood up abruptly, knocking over his drink. "You're going to want to run now." The thing let out a sound that I can only describe as silence being ripped apart. The glass spiderwebbed under its hand, cracking and groaning as it began to step inside. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, other me right behind me. The bell above the door let out a cheery jingle as we ran into the street. "What is that?" I yelled, spinning to face him. "Long story short?" Other me panted, looking alarmingly pleased with himself. "It's the reason I don't live in my timeline anymore." "You brought that thing here?" "It was an accident." The shadow thing oozed out of the coffee shop, stepping onto the pavement with the wrong number of limbs. 6, maybe 8, shifting as it moved. People on the street didn't seem to notice it. They kept walking, staring at their phones, oblivious to the monster crawling into their world. Other me grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." "Where?" "Somewhere far away from here. Anywhere. Just trust me." "Why would I trust you?" "Because I am you, and you know you're good under pressure." Reluctantly, I followed him, sprinting down side streets and alleys while the thing pursued us, its movement silent but unmistakable. Every time I glanced back, it was closer, its form flickering like an image on a broken TV. Finally, other me skidded to a stop in an alley and turned to me, breathless. "We have one shot at this."
At what?
He dug into his pocket and pulled out a small, black marble that seemed to absorb the light around it. It pulsed faintly in his palm. It's what it wants. If I throw it, it'll follow." I stared at the marble. "Where did you even get that?" "Someplace I shouldn't have been," he said grimly. "It doesn't matter now." "Then throw it." Other me hesitated, looking at me for just a moment too long. And in that moment, the thing rounded the corner, looming tall as it poured into the alley like liquid shadow. Other me turned, raised the marble high, and hurled it into the air with a shout. The marble split apart mid-flight, unraveling into a swirl of black light that spiraled upward like a miniature hurricane. The creature shrieked, an ear-splitting, bone-deep noise, and lunged after it. As the marble vanished, so did the creature, sucked into the swirling light until the alley was empty again. The silence that followed was deafening. I turned to Other Me, ready to yell at him for dragging me into this mess, but he was already fading. Literally. His form was going transparent, like he was being erased. "What's happening to you?" I demanded. "Guess I was never supposed to be here," he said with a grin that looked both smug and sad. "Thanks for the help, though." And then he was gone. I was left alone in the alley, heart pounding, the last remnants of that swirling black light disappearing into nothing. For a while, I just stood there, breathing hard, trying to process the fact that I just helped myself save the universe, or something close to it. When I finally got home, my burnt chai latte was still sitting on the table. It felt like a lifetime ago. So yeah, I met myself, fought off a shadow monster, possibly stopped an interdimensional collapse. What did you do with your Wednesday? I had always been told not to go into the woods after dark. Growing up, everyone in my small town whispered the same thing. The forest has rules, and it doesn't forgive those who break them. Most people followed the warning without question, myself included, but something about that night was different. The air had been strange all day, heavy and humming, like the world itself was holding its breath. I felt it when I woke up, sharp and electric, and it stayed with me through school, through dinner, through the evening news. By the time the sun disappeared and the first stars blinked to life, I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. I had to go outside. It was like something had reached inside my chest and tied a string around my heart, pulling me toward the trees. The woods weren't far from my house, just across the old train tracks and beyond a rusty chain-link fence that had collapsed in on itself years ago. The trees were massive and ancient, so closely packed that even the moonlight struggled to get through. But when I stood at the edge of the forest, peering in, it wasn't darkness that I saw. There were lights, small, glowing orbs, floating like lazy fireflies deeper among the trees. They bobbed and weaved in the air, too perfect to be random, too strange to ignore. I told myself it was probably kids with flashlights or lanterns, some harmless prank, but I knew that was a lie. There was no one out here except me. The lights were waiting. I stepped over the fence and into the trees, my sneakers sinking into the soft, loamy earth. The air changed immediately. It was colder here, sharper, but it carried a scent that was oddly sweet, like burnt sugar and pine needles. I glanced back to where the streetlights had been, but they were gone, swallowed completely by the trees. I kept walking, following the lights. The further I went, the more the woods came alive. I could hear sounds all around me, leaves rustling, faint footsteps that never matched my own, whispers that faded before I could catch the words. I told myself it was just animals, the wind, my imagination, but the lights never stopped moving. They led me deeper and deeper, and with every step, the humming in my chest grew louder. After what felt like hours, I entered a clearing. The ground here was covered in silver grass that shimmered faintly, like frost under starlight. In the center of the clearing was a stone archway, so tall and wide it looked like it had been built for giants. Vines wrapped around its frame, pulsing faintly with light, and carved into the stone were symbols I didn't recognize. Sharp, swirling patterns that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking. The air around the arch was wrong. It vibrated softly, as though it were alive. And then I saw the figure. It stood at the base of the archway, its back to me, cloaked in something that looked like shadow stitched together with silver thread. Its head was slightly tilted, like it was listening for something. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but my body wouldn't listen. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Slowly, the figure turned, and I saw its face, or rather, the absence of it. There was nothing there, just smooth darkness where its features should have been. But it had eyes, 2 pinpricks of light that burned white-hot in the black void, locking onto me like a predator spotting prey. "You're early," it said, and the voice came from everywhere at once, soft and echoing, like a bell ringing underwater. But no matter. You're here now. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, but no words came out. The figure gestured toward the archway. "You've come for the door. That's why they sent you." Its tone was almost conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "You're not the first, but perhaps you'll be the last." "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to choke out. My voice sounded small, insignificant. It tilted its head again, as though considering me. "They never do at first, but you'll understand soon enough." Then, without another word, it stepped aside, leaving the path to the archway clear. The lights that had led me here began to swirl faster now, darting through the air like sparks from a fire. I couldn't see anything beyond the archway, just an endless, black void. But something about it called to me, the same way the woods had called to me hours before. The string around my heart tightened, tugging me forward. I looked back, hoping to see the way I'd come, but the forest was gone. There was nothing but blackness surrounding the clearing now, as though the world itself had been erased. I took a step toward the archway, and the figure spoke again. "Once you enter, there's no going back. The door takes as much as it gives." Its burning eyes narrowed. "Are you ready to pay the price?" "What price?" I asked. The figure didn't answer. It simply watched as I stood there, torn between terror and curiosity. My entire life, I'd felt like I was waiting for something. A sign, a purpose, a moment that would change everything. This felt like that moment, and I couldn't walk away. So I stepped through. The world flipped. That's the only way I can describe it. One moment, I was in the clearing, and the next, I was falling through darkness that stretched forever. I could see shapes in the black, a city made of glass towers, a forest of trees with golden leaves, a river that flowed straight into the sky. Time didn't exist here. I was everywhere and nowhere all at once, and then I hit the ground. I opened my eyes to find myself standing on a narrow bridge made of bone-white stone, suspended high above an ocean of mist. The sky above me was crimson, with 2 suns hanging low on the horizon, their light bleeding across the clouds like ink in water. In the distance, at the far end of the bridge, I saw a tower. It rose out of the mist, impossibly tall, its walls etched with glowing symbols that matched the ones I'd seen on the archway. I knew, somehow, that I was supposed to go there. As I walked, I realized I wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the mist below, shapes that were almost human but wrong. Arms too long, heads tilted at unnatural angles. They watched me silently as I crossed, their presence prickling against my skin. The humming in my chest grew louder with every step, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. When I finally reached the tower, its massive doors opened on their own, welcoming me inside. The interior of the tower was endless. Room after room stretched before me, libraries filled with books whose pages wrote themselves as I watched, gardens where flowers whispered secrets in voices too soft to understand, mirrors that didn't reflect me but showed glimpses of other places, other lives. And at the heart of the tower, I found the figure waiting for me again, its burning eyes watching from the shadows. "This is what you sought," it said, and I realized that its voice was no longer terrifying. It was familiar, like something I'd known all along but forgotten. "The question is, what will you do with it?" The figure stepped aside, and there, at the center of the room, was a book. Its cover was plain, unmarked, but I knew it was mine. I reached for it, my hands shaking, and opened to the first page. It was blank. "The story is yours to write," the figure whispered. "But remember, Every choice has a cost. I looked up, but the figure was gone. The tower was silent, the book heavy in my hands. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that blank page, feeling the weight of everything it meant. When I finally stepped out of the tower, I was back in the clearing, the stone archway behind me. The lights were gone, the woods were still, and the world was waiting. It started with the plant. Not a real plant, mind you, but a virtual one. A little pixelated sprout in an app that I downloaded on a whim. The app promised to help me focus by gamifying productivity. Each time I finished a task, the plant would grow a little taller. The concept was simple. Work hard, build a forest. Fail, and your tree would die. It sounded harmless enough. Fun, even. Except for one thing. I was not prepared for how seriously this plant would take itself. The first time I missed a deadline, I didn't think much of it. I'd been procrastinating, sure, but life happens. Then my phone buzzed with a notification. Your plant is struggling. I opened the app to find the tiny green sprout drooping dramatically, its little leaves curled inward like a Victorian maiden fainting onto a chaise. Beneath it, a single sentence glared back at me. Every choice matters. Every choice? I was just 10 minutes late finishing an email. But fine, I got the message. I threw myself into work the next day, determined to redeem myself, and sure enough, the plant perked up. It even grew a new leaf. My phone sent me a congratulatory notification that read, "You're nurturing success." And that was how it hooked me. I didn't realize I was falling into a trap until I woke up one morning to a second notification. It's been 12 hours since you last tended to your forest. Is everything okay? I blinked at my phone. Why are you worried about me? I muttered, but the concern felt so weirdly personal that I opened the app out of guilt. The plant was fine, thriving, in fact, but there was now a second sprout beside it. A tiny new tree had appeared overnight, its roots spreading like it had claimed squatters' rights. A message at the bottom of the screen explained, "You've unlocked level 2. Balance productivity across multiple projects to grow your forest." Multiple projects? I was barely managing one plant, and now I had two? I tried to laugh it off, but the app wasn't kidding. By the end of the week, I had 4 plants, each tied to a different task. Emails, meetings, creative work, fitness. Every time I fell behind, the app sent increasingly passive-aggressive notifications. Your forest is wilting. Stay focused. Or worse, your plants are counting on you. Counting on me? They were plants. Fake ones. But somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was letting them down. Things escalated quickly. One night, I stayed up until 2 a.m. finishing a project I'd been procrastinating on. Not because I cared about the deadline, but because I couldn't bear the thought of my virtual cactus dying of neglect. The next morning, I found myself apologizing out loud to a cartoon fern for taking too long to make breakfast. "This is getting ridiculous," I told my friend over lunch a few days later. She laughed. "You're telling me a game is guilt-tripping you?" "It's not guilt-tripping," I argued. "It's incentivizing. It's supposed to help me focus." "You sound like someone defending a toxic relationship," she said. And honestly, she wasn't wrong. Things reached peak absurdity the following week. I was working on a presentation, deeply in the zone, when my phone buzzed. I ignored it at first, assuming it was a text or an email, but then it buzzed again and again. I finally picked it up to find a string of notifications from the app. "Your oak is feeling neglected. Your ficus needs attention. Don't let your maple down." "Are you serious?" I groaned, opening the app. Sure enough, my little digital forest was in shambles. The oak had lost half its leaves, the ficus was leaning sideways like a drunk uncle, and the maple had turned an alarming shade of brown. Okay, I muttered, clicking through my to-do list like I was defibrillating a dying patient. "I'm working. You can stop guilt-shaming me now." The plants slowly recovered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line. This wasn't just a productivity app anymore. It was a full-blown commitment. That night, I deleted it. I felt a pang of guilt as I watched the icon disappear from my screen, like I was abandoning a tiny forest to fend for itself in the void of cyberspace. But I told myself it was for the best. No more virtual plants. No more notifications. Just freedom. Or so I thought. The next morning, I woke up to an email. The subject line read, "We miss you, user." I opened it cautiously. Inside was a picture of my cartoon forest, now faded and gray, with a single sentence beneath it. "Your plants are waiting for you." I stared at the screen, equal parts amused and horrified. They'd sent me a breakup email. That was 2 weeks ago, and I still think about those little plants. Sometimes I wonder if they're still there, quietly waiting for me to come back. Other times, I wonder if they've all just disappeared. But here's the weird thing. Since deleting the app, I've started keeping a real plant on my desk. A tiny succulent that doesn't send me notifications or demand progress reports. And yet, every time I water it, I feel a strange, lingering sense of satisfaction. Maybe the app was onto something after all. What about you? Have you ever gotten way too emotionally attached to something digital? Or is that just me and my weird, guilt-inducing forest? Every Friday night, we wrote messages for the wind. It started because of her grandma. She told me about it one evening while we sat on the fire escape, the city glowing faintly below us. She used to tell me that the wind carries stories, she said. When she was little, she'd whisper her secrets to it, and she swore the wind would take them to someone who needed to hear them. I smirked. Your grandma believed in wind mail? She rolled her eyes. Not mail. Messages. It's not about getting a response. It's about trusting the wind to deliver something you can't carry anymore. Like therapy, I teased. Exactly, she said, poking my ribs with a laugh. But cooler, because it doesn't cost $200 an hour. A week later, she showed up with a pack of index cards, a marker, and a ball of twine. We're doing it tonight, she said. Doing what? Sending messages to the wind. Come on, you're not chicken, are you? I'm definitely chicken, I replied, but I followed her up to the roof anyway. The first message was hers. She wrote, in big, loopy letters, "Please, just let me feel lighter." She tied the card to a length of twine, held it out into the breeze, and let it flutter for a moment before untying it and tossing it into the air. We both watched as it spun, dipped, and finally vanished into the night. "Your turn," she said, handing me the marker. I hesitated. It felt silly, childish even, but there was something in the way she watched me. Hopeful, like she believed the wind was waiting. So I wrote the first thing that came to mind. "I don't know what I'm doing." She snorted when she read it, but didn't say anything. I tied it to the twine, held it out, and let it go. Watching that card disappear into the dark felt oddly satisfying, like exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. From then on, Friday nights became our ritual. We'd climb to the roof armed with a pile of index cards and a thermos of tea, and we'd write our messages. Sometimes they were simple, tiny confessions or wishes we didn't know how to say out loud. "I miss you. I'm scared, but I'm trying. Let it all work out." Other times, they were absurd. She once wrote, "Dear wind, please tell the moon I think it's hot." Another night, I wrote, "Bring me tacos," and she laughed so hard she nearly spilled the tea. We started making it a game. We'd write questions, strange, unanswerable ones, and wonder if the wind carried them far enough for someone to hear. What's the color of regret? Do stars hum when no one's watching? Who decided we have to wear pants to be taken seriously? Do you think anyone finds them? I asked once, watching one of her cards disappear over the edge of the roof. She shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe they just dissolve somewhere. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to know. One night, she wrote something different. Instead of her usual questions or jokes, she scribbled, "If you find this, tell me what you're afraid of." I stared at her, surprised. "You think someone will actually respond?" "Who knows?" she said, tying the card to the twine. But the way her voice softened made me wonder if she was hoping they would. For weeks after, she added variations of that message to her stack. What's your biggest dream? What do you regret the most? What's the last thing that made you happy? I didn't think much of it, just assumed it was her version of shouting questions into the void, until the day we found a response. It was a Tuesday afternoon. We were walking back from the bodega when she froze, her eyes locked on a piece of paper caught in the branches of a tree. She darted forward, plucked it free, and stared at it, wide-eyed. "Holy crap," she breathed, holding it up. The paper was crumpled, the ink smudged, but it was unmistakable. "I'm afraid of losing the people I love." "That's from someone?" I asked, bewildered. She nodded, a slow grin spreading across her face. "Looks like it." After that, the messages felt different. The idea that someone out there might be reading them, even answering, made the wind feel alive, like a giant invisible thread tying us to people we couldn't see. We started getting braver with our words. She wrote, "I feel like I'm running out of time." I wrote, "What if I'm not enough?" The wind carried it all away, and I imagined someone, somewhere, holding those fragile pieces of us in their hands. We didn't find another response for months, but when we did, it was tucked into the crack of a brick wall near the park. It was simple, scrawled on a torn piece of napkin, "You are?" It wasn't addressed to anyone, but I like to think it was for us. Then, one Friday, she didn't show up. I waited on the roof for an hour, the cards and marker growing heavy in my hands, but she didn't come. When I called, she didn't answer. I didn't know what to do, so I wrote anyway. My message that night was messy, rushed. "Where did you go?" The wind didn't answer, but it carried the card away all the same. She didn't come the next Friday, or the one after that. Eventually, I heard through a mutual friend that she'd moved to another city, chasing a job she'd always wanted but never told me about. I wanted to be angry, but all I could feel was hollow. I kept writing. Every Friday, I climbed to the roof and sent my messages into the wind. At first, they were all about her. "I wish you'd said goodbye. Do you miss this too? Why did you leave me here alone?" But over time, the messages changed. I started writing to myself, to the sky, to whoever might be listening. "I'm learning how to be okay. The world is big and strange, and I think I like it." One Friday, months later, I found a card tucked under a rock on the roof. The handwriting was familiar. It said, "I thought I'd feel lighter, but I don't. Tell the wind I'm sorry." I didn't know if she'd come back or if the wind had somehow carried it to me, but I smiled, held the card to my chest, and whispered, "I forgive you." What about you? Have you ever sent something out into the world, hoping it would find the person who needed it most? When I was 9 years old, my father brought home a piano. It wasn't the kind of elegant, polished piano you'd see in rich people's homes. This one was old and battered, the wood scuffed and darkened with age, keys yellowed like ancient teeth. He'd bought it from an estate sale for $50 and a handshake, dragged it through the front door with the help of 2 neighbors, and plopped it into the corner of our living room like it had always been there. I remember watching them struggle, sweat dripping from their brows as they grunted and cursed, and wondering why anyone would go through so much trouble for something that didn't even look nice. "It's got character," my father said proudly, patting the side of the piano as though it were a living thing. "Just needs some love, that's all." For the first few days, no one touched it. My father would stare at it occasionally, muttering about how he was going to fix her up and make her sing again. But he never did. He didn't know the first thing about pianos. My mom hated the thing. She said it smelled like mildew and claimed it was probably infested with spiders. My sister Carly refused to even look at it, but that wasn't surprising. Carly was 12 and in the throes of full-on preteen rebellion. Anything Dad liked, she automatically hated. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop staring at it. Something about it fascinated me. Maybe it was the way it didn't quite belong. This heavy, shadowy thing squatting in the corner like it was waiting for something. Or maybe it was the way the air around it felt different, just slightly colder. It wasn't until the 5th night that I finally approached it. Everyone else had gone to bed, and I was curled up on the couch with a flashlight and a book when I heard it. A note? Soft, low, and brief, like a whisper. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, this time slightly louder. The sound came from the piano. I set the book down and crept toward it, my bare feet silent on the carpet. "Hello?" I whispered because 9-year-old logic dictates that you say hello to empty rooms when they make noises. Of course, no one answered. The piano sat there, its lid shut, as still and unresponsive as ever. I hesitated before reaching out and pressing one of the keys, a middle C. The sound rang out, pure and clear, echoing through the otherwise silent house. I pressed another key, then another, and each one responded perfectly, despite the piano's age. The keys were smooth and cool under my fingers, and even though I didn't know how to play, I felt an odd satisfaction in hearing the sounds I created. Then I heard the whisper. It was so faint at first that I almost missed it. Just a breath, really. I turned around, half expecting to see my father scolding me for playing with the piano so late, but the living room was empty. I frowned and turned back, my fingers hovering above the keys. I played another note, a low, rumbling A. This time, the whisper came immediately, clearer than before, and it came from inside the piano. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. Slowly, I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the wood. The whisper was louder now, unmistakably a voice, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like someone speaking through a wall, muffled but insistent. I bolted upstairs, dove under my covers, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I didn't tell anyone about the whisper. I wanted to, I almost did, but every time I tried, I'd picture their faces and imagine them laughing or calling me imaginative. I was already the weird kid in the family, always reading ghost stories and talking about monsters. I didn't want to give them more reasons to tease me, so I kept quiet. Over the next few weeks, the piano became a fixture in our lives. My father ignored it. My mom continued to complain about the smell, and Carly refused to acknowledge its existence. But at night, it would whisper, always faint at first, growing louder if I dared to touch the keys. I stopped playing it after a while. The first time I'd heard the voice, it had been distant and unintelligible, but now the words were becoming clearer, and I didn't want to hear what it had to say. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd lie in bed and hear a note ring out from the living room, a single, hollow sound that would linger for far too long. My parents never seemed to hear it. Neither did Carly, but I did. One night, I woke up to the sound of music. My heart nearly stopped. It wasn't chaotic or loud. It was soft and deliberate, a gentle melody that filled the house like fog. I sat up in bed, my body rigid, and listened. It was coming from the piano. Someone was playing it. I crept out of bed, my legs shaking as I padded down the hallway. The living room was dark except for a thin sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains, and the piano was open. Its keys moved on their own, pressing down one by one, as though guided by invisible hands. The melody was haunting, simple, repetitive, and terribly sad. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, frozen, staring at the piano as it sat perfectly still, the final note still hanging in the air. "Please," a voice said. I gasped, stumbling back into the coffee table. The voice had come from the piano. It was louder now, clearer. "Please," it said again, faint but pleading. "Let me out." I don't know how long I stood there, too terrified to move. I finally ran back to my room, tears streaming down my face, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my dad that I wanted the piano gone. He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "What? Why? I thought you liked it." "It's broken," I said, voice trembling. "It makes noises. At night." He rolled his eyes. "It's just an old piano. You're imagining things." I begged him to get rid of it, but he wouldn't. "It's fine," he said firmly. "Nothing's wrong with it." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the music to start again. But it didn't. This time, there were no whispers, no notes, no pleading, just silence. In the morning, Carly was gone. My parents thought she'd run away. They called the police, filed a report, searched the neighborhood, but no one found her. Days turned into weeks, and the search slowed, then stopped. The police said kids her age ran away all the time. But I knew. The night she disappeared, I'd heard it. One last note, loud and echoing, and then the whisper, "Thank you." I didn't touch the piano again. I didn't go near it. My parents moved it to the garage after a while, as though doing so might erase what had happened. Eventually, we moved out of the house altogether. Years later, I came back. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. Or guilt. The house was abandoned now, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling. I wandered through the empty rooms, kicking up dust, listening to the quiet. The living room was the same as I remembered, except for the corner where the piano had been. It was empty now, just a patch of discolored carpet and a faint outline on the wall. I stood there for a long time. Then I heard it, a whisper. "Let me out." The first time I noticed the crack, it was in my bathroom mirror. I had just finished brushing my teeth when I leaned closer, squinting at my reflection. A thin fracture ran from the bottom corner up to the center, splitting my face in two. It was so faint I almost missed it, like a spider web glinting in the right light. I touched it gingerly, half expecting the glass to crumble, but it didn't. It felt smooth, unbroken. I hadn't dropped the mirror. I hadn't slammed the door or punched the wall. My apartment is quiet, boringly quiet, and I live alone. Yet there it was, a crack that shouldn't have been there. I frowned, shrugged, and left for work, convinced I'd imagined it. But when I came home that night, the crack had grown. It was subtle at first, just an extra inch creeping toward the top of the mirror, like something spreading beneath the surface. I turned on the light, staring at it for a full minute, and then I did what any normal person does. I Googled it. How do mirrors crack on their own? The answers were boring. Settling foundation, temperature changes. Nothing matched my situation, but I didn't think much more about it. I decided I'd replace it soon and went to bed. The next morning, the crack wasn't just bigger. It had multiplied. Thin, jagged lines sprawled across the mirror now, fanning out like a frozen spiderweb. When I looked closer, something caught my eye. There was movement in the cracks. A flicker, a shimmer, like water catching the sun. I leaned closer, holding my breath, and for the briefest moment, I swore I saw something on the other side. Not my reflection, but shapes. Shadows. I yanked back so fast I nearly fell, my heart pounding. The shadows disappeared, and the mirror looked normal again. Well, as normal as a cracked mirror can look. I laughed nervously at myself. Lack of sleep, I thought. Too many late nights. It's just my brain playing tricks. That was the last day I believed that. By Thursday, the cracks had spread to the windows in my apartment. I woke up to sunlight streaming through fractured glass, the jagged lines casting patterns across the walls. I checked all the panes, and sure enough, every single one of them was cracked. Hairline fractures spiraling outward like veins. I ran my hands over the surfaces, but they were perfectly smooth, just like the mirror. Something wasn't right. I called my landlord, but the line went dead the moment I mentioned the cracks. I tried again. Same thing. A low hum crackled through the phone, followed by silence. I pulled it away from my ear, staring at the screen. No service. I glanced at my Wi-Fi router. Dead too. Outside, the world looked muted. The sky was too pale, the light too soft, as though someone had put a filter over reality. The people on the sidewalk moved strangely, their steps a little too synchronized, their heads turning in perfect unison when a car passed. I watched them from my cracked window, a hollow feeling growing in my stomach. Then, for the first time, I noticed the noise. It was faint at first, like a whisper from behind the walls. A low, pulsing hum that rose and fell in rhythm with my heartbeat. I pressed my ear to the bathroom door, holding my breath. The sound grew louder, vibrating in my bones. It wasn't coming from behind the walls. It was coming from the mirror. I hesitated, dread coiling in my gut. My reflection stared back at me. Same eyes, same face, but something was wrong. Its movements were half a beat behind mine, lagging just enough to notice. Slowly, I raised my hand. My reflection did the same. But when it touched the cracks, the surface rippled like water. I stumbled back, knocking over a towel rack. My reflection didn't move. It stayed at the mirror's edge, its hand still pressed to the glass, as if testing it. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then it smiled. It wasn't my smile. I ran. I grabbed my bag, threw on my coat, and bolted out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street. The air outside was thick and heavy, like walking through syrup. The people still moved in their unnatural rhythm, their heads swiveling too smoothly to watch me pass. I didn't stop running until I reached the cafe 4 blocks away. Inside, everything seemed normal at first. Customers sat at tables, chatting over their coffees, and the barista greeted me with a bright smile. I nearly sobbed with relief as I ordered a cup of coffee and collapsed into a corner booth. I told myself I was safe here, surrounded by other people, away from my apartment. Then I noticed the window. The cracks had followed me. They spiderwebbed across the cafe's glass, faint but unmistakable. And worse, I could see shadows moving in them. Shapes, shifting and flickering like silhouettes against a curtain. I turned to the barista, my voice shaking. "Hey, do you see that? The cracks in the window?" The barista's smile froze on her face, and for a split second, her eyes flickered. Not blinking, flickering, like a light bulb about to burn out. "What cracks?" she asked, her voice flat and wrong, like a recording played a little too slow. I grabbed my coffee and backed away, stumbling into the street. The cracks were everywhere now, running through storefront windows, car windshields, even the sky itself. I looked up, and my breath caught. A massive fracture stretched across the clouds, dark shapes writhing behind it, too large and too many to comprehend. The hum returned, louder now, vibrating the ground beneath my feet. When I turned to go back to my apartment, I realized I couldn't tell where I was anymore. The streets didn't match. The buildings looked stretched, their edges curving like melted wax. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have. I tried to retrace my route, but every corner I turned led me somewhere new. Alleys that shouldn't exist, roads that twisted in on themselves. Finally, I stopped. In front of me, in the middle of the sidewalk, was a full-length mirror. It was standing upright, unsupported, its surface cracked and rippling faintly. My reflection was waiting for me on the other side. It didn't smile this time. It just raised its hand, beckoning me forward. The hum grew deafening. The cracks in the sky widened, spilling a sickly golden light onto the streets. The buildings trembled. The people froze mid-step, their heads turning slowly in unison to face me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The mirror shimmered, its cracks glowing brighter. I knew that if I stepped through, I wouldn't come back. But as the ground split beneath my feet and the world began to collapse, I realized I didn't have a choice. I reached out. My reflection took my hand, and everything went silent. I woke up in my apartment. The mirror was gone. The windows were whole. The cracks had vanished, as though they'd never been there at all. Outside, the city was alive again. Cars honking, people laughing, the sky bright and clear. But when I look at my reflection, it still lags, just a little. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can hear it whispering. It started on the subway, late at night. I was coming home after a soul-crushingly long shift, the kind that makes you wonder if your boss secretly hates you. The train car was nearly empty, just me and a guy in a suit who looked like he regretted every decision that had led him there. You know the vibe, fluorescent lights buzzing, the faint smell of stale coffee and despair, and the occasional squeal of the wheels on the tracks. And then the train stopped. Not at a station. Not with the usual announcement of train traffic ahead. Just a sudden, lurching halt in the middle of the tunnel. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the car into complete darkness. "Great," I muttered, because of course this would happen tonight. I fumbled for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but before I could, the intercom crackled to life. But instead of the bored conductor announcing a delay, a strange voice came through. "Attention, passengers. The game will now begin." The words were calm, even cheerful, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, my phone slipping out of my hand and clattering to the floor. Across the car, the guy in the suit let out a nervous laugh. "Is this a prank?" he asked, his voice shaky. The intercom crackled again. "Rules are simple. Survive the next stop." I didn't get a chance to ask what that meant, because the lights came back on, and the train started moving. Only, it wasn't moving forward anymore. It was moving down. The entire car tilted slightly, like we were on some impossibly steep incline, and the sound of the wheels changed, a deep metallic groan that reverberated in my chest. I clung to the pole for balance, my heart hammering as the guy across from me scrambled to his feet. "Where the hell are we going?" he shouted. I didn't have an answer. The windows, which usually showed the dark blur of tunnels, were now pitch black. No lights, no walls, just an endless void stretching in every direction. The train kept descending, faster and faster, until my stomach lurched like I was on the world's worst roller coaster. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the train stopped. The doors slid open with a cheerful ding. We stared at them, neither of us moving. Outside, there was nothing but a thick, swirling fog that seemed to pulse with faint, flickering light. It wasn't a station. It wasn't anything. Don't, I said, when the guy in the suit took a hesitant step toward the doors. We can't just stay here, he said, his voice trembling. What if it's, I don't know, an evacuation or something? It's not, I said, though I didn't have any proof. I just knew. And then the intercom crackled again. First stop, the Hunter. Please exit the train. The guy froze, his foot hovering over the threshold. The what? Before I could respond, the lights in the train flickered again, and something moved in the fog. It was subtle at first, just a faint ripple, like the air was shifting, but then I saw it. A dark silhouette, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that bent in ways no limbs should. Its head, or what I assumed was its head, tilted toward us, and even though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze, cold and unrelenting. Get back, I whispered, grabbing the guy's arm and pulling him away from the door. But it was too late. The thing moved faster than I thought possible, its shape distorting as it lunged toward the train. The guy screamed, stumbling backward, but the thing didn't come for him. It hit an invisible barrier at the edge of the door. The entire train shuddered as the creature slammed against it, its limbs scrabbling against the unseen wall. Its head twisted toward me, and for a split second, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale nothingness. The intercom crackled again. Passengers must exit to continue. The thing hit the barrier again, harder this time. Cracks spiderwebbed across the glass, and the entire train groaned under the impact. We have to go, the guy said, his voice high-pitched with panic. If we don't, we're not going out there, I snapped. But the cracks were spreading, faster now. Whatever was holding the creature back wouldn't hold for much longer. The guy made a decision before I could stop him. He bolted for the doors, leaping out into the fog. Wait, I shouted. But he was already gone, his figure swallowed by the mist. The train doors slid shut behind him with a quiet ding. And then the screaming started. It wasn't just his screams. It was something else, something guttural and otherworldly that echoed in my chest. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The train shuddered again and started moving. This time, it didn't tilt. It just glided forward into the darkness, leaving the fog and the screaming behind. I slumped into one of the seats, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. The intercom crackled. Congratulations, Player 1. You have advanced to the next round. I didn't feel like a winner. The train sped up, the lights flickering overhead, and I noticed something I hadn't before. The car was different. The seats were no longer the usual cracked plastic. They were sleek and black, gleaming faintly under the flickering lights. The windows weren't just dark. They were gone, replaced by smooth metal panels. And then I saw the graffiti. It hadn't been there before. Scrawled across the walls in jagged, messy letters were phrases like, "No exit," and "Don't trust the voice," and, my personal favorite, "It's watching you." I was still staring at the words when the train began to slow. The intercom crackled again. Second stop, the mirror. Please exit the train. I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body screamed to stay put, to wait it out. But the memory of the cracks in the glass, and that thing in the fog, kept me frozen in my seat. The doors slid open. This time, there was no fog. Just a long, dimly lit hallway stretching into the distance. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting the train's interior. But when I looked closer, I realized the reflections weren't right. In the mirror closest to me, my reflection was standing, but I wasn't. I was still slumped in my seat, gripping the pole. The reflection turned toward me, smiling with too many teeth. Please exit the train, the intercom repeated, more insistent this time. The reflection tilted its head, raising a hand to knock on the glass. And I realized the mirrors weren't for me. They were windows. The reflection wasn't trying to show me something. It was trying to get in. The letter arrived with no return address, sealed with red wax and an imprint of something that looked like a crow mid-flight. It landed on my kitchen table between bills and takeout menus, standing out like it didn't belong. Like it knew it didn't belong. I stared at it for a long time before touching it, feeling inexplicably watched, as if the letter itself was waiting for me to make a move. When I finally broke the seal, my hands shook, though I couldn't explain why. The paper inside was thick, the ink so dark it looked wet. The handwriting was sharp and angular, as though whoever wrote it had carved the words into the page. Your presence has been requested. You are not late yet. No name, no explanation, just those words and an address that I didn't recognize, though it was in my city. I don't know why I decided to go. Maybe it was boredom or that nagging curiosity that seems to creep into the quiet moments of life, whispering, what if? My life had fallen into a rhythm of predictability, work, food, sleep, repeat, and the idea that someone, somewhere, wanted me for something stirred me like a half-forgotten song. I told myself I'd just check it out, see what kind of prank or mistake it might be. The address led me to an old part of the city I'd never seen before. The street names were faded, the buildings worn down, stoic in their age. The address belonged to a small, unmarked door tucked between two crumbling warehouses. It was painted black, the kind of black that seemed to pull the light from around it. There was no bell, no knocker, just the door. I hesitated, staring at my reflection in its glossy surface, feeling for the first time that maybe I'd wandered somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, the door opened on its own. Not outward or inward, but sideways, sliding like a panel in a wall. Behind it was darkness, deep and still. I thought about running. Instead, I stepped inside. The darkness swallowed me whole. For a moment, I couldn't see, couldn't hear. I felt weightless, as though I were suspended in nothingness. Then, one by one, lights blinked on above me. Hanging bulbs that swayed slightly, casting long, strange shadows across the space. I was standing in what looked like an underground hall, impossibly vast. The ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. The floor beneath me was marble, veined in gold, though parts of it looked cracked and patched with stone that didn't match. Rows of tables stretched across the room, each one draped in heavy black cloth and set with items I couldn't quite make out. Jars filled with liquid, strange trinkets, bones that didn't look human. The air smelled faintly of copper and something sweet, like overripe fruit. I wasn't alone. People moved between the tables, their footsteps oddly quiet. They were dressed in mismatched clothes that looked both old and new. Top hats paired with sneakers, velvet cloaks over jeans. Some wore masks made of porcelain or wood, covering their faces completely. Others kept their heads down, their hair falling forward to hide their features. They all moved with a sense of purpose, as though they'd been here many times before and knew exactly what they were looking for. A woman in a dark green coat with sleeves that hung past her hands appeared beside me, her mask a smooth oval of white with no mouth and no eyes, only slits where eyes should be. "First time?" she asked, her voice light and curious, though her mask never moved. I nodded, unsure what to say. "Don't touch anything unless you're prepared to pay," she added, then turned and disappeared into the crowd before I could ask her what that meant. I wandered between the tables, trying not to stare too long at anything. At one, a man with hands that were far too large was selling jars labeled "Captured Whispers." The jars vibrated faintly when I passed, the sound of 100 hushed voices hissing against the glass. At another table, a figure in a cloak so dark it seemed to shift with the light was offering "Lost Moments," small silver pendants that pulsed softly, each one tied to a memory that someone, somewhere, had let slip away. "Take one," the figure said when they saw me looking. Their voice was both male and female, layered and strange. "Find what you've forgotten." I shook my head quickly and hurried on. In the center of the hall was a massive clock, its face cracked, its hands turning backward in fits and starts. Around it, people gathered, exchanging items I couldn't quite see. The closer I got to it, the heavier the air felt, pressing against my skin and slowing my steps. I stopped a few feet away, my head pounding, and noticed someone watching me from the other side of the clock. He stood out from the others, not because he wasn't wearing a mask, but because he looked so ordinary. He wore a threadbare suit and scuffed shoes, his hair sticking up as though he'd run his hands through it one too many times. He smiled faintly when he caught me looking and motioned for me to follow him. Against my better judgment, I did. He led me to a quiet corner where the tables were smaller, the items on display more unsettling. Rings made of teeth, mirrors that reflected things I couldn't see. He sat down at one of the tables and gestured for me to sit across from him. "You're brave," he said, studying me with dark eyes that seemed older than his face. "Most people don't make it this far on their first visit." "What is this place?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. He tilted his head, as though considering the question. "A market," he said finally, "but not for things you'd find in your world. Here, we trade in the unseen, the forgotten, the never-was." "Why me?" I whispered. Why was I invited? His smile faded. "Because you're carrying something you don't need, something that weighs you down." He reached beneath the table and pulled out a box, small and wooden, its surface carved with intricate patterns. "Would you like to trade it?" I stared at the box, my throat dry. "Trade what?" "Your burden," he said simply. "The thing that keeps you awake at night. The thing you don't talk about." I thought about saying no, about running back the way I'd come. But instead, I found myself nodding. "What do I get in return?" His smile returned, soft and almost sad. "Whatever the market thinks you need." I reached out and touched the box. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, something inside me shifted. A weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lifted, leaving me dizzy and hollow. When I pulled my hand back, the box was gone. In its place was a small, silver key. I picked it up carefully, half expecting it to disappear. "What does it open?" I asked. The man stood, his chair scraping softly against the marble floor. "That's for you to find out." Before I could ask anything else, the lights above flickered. The air around me thickened, and a deep, low chime rang out from the broken clock. All at once, the people in the hall began to move, heading toward doors that hadn't been there before. Arched openings lined with black curtains that swayed as though caught in a breeze. I looked back at the man, but he was gone. I followed the crowd, clutching the key tightly in my hand. As I stepped through one of the doors, the hall behind me vanished. I was standing in the alley outside the black door, the night air sharp and cold. My car was parked where I'd left it, my phone buzzing with messages. It was like I'd never been gone. But when I looked down at my hand, the key was still there, gleaming softly in the moonlight. I don't know what it opens. I don't know if I'll ever find out. But the weight I carried for so long is gone, and for now, that's enough. Have you ever been given something you didn't understand, but couldn't let go of? The city was alive in its own strange way, its heartbeat found in the hum of neon signs and the faint crackle of power lines overhead. Rain fell in rhythmic sheets, turning the pavement into a mosaic of flickering reflections. I hadn't planned to be out this late, but the pull of the streets had been stronger than my better judgment. They always whispered to me, promising that if I kept walking, I'd find something worth finding. I was 3 blocks past nowhere when I saw it. A door standing in the middle of the alley. No walls, no frame, just a door. Tall and dark, its surface marked with faint, intricate carvings that seemed to twist and shimmer in the rain. A single brass handle gleamed under the faint glow of a flickering street lamp. It was the kind of thing you walked away from if you had any sense. I didn't. The air around it felt strange, thicker somehow, pressing against my skin like a warning I didn't want to hear. But curiosity, that endless thief of caution, had already taken hold. I reached out and grasped the handle. It was warm, almost too warm, and the moment I turned it, the door swung open soundlessly. On the other side was a room. It wasn't what I expected. Not a portal to some otherworldly hellscape. Not a void of endless stars. but a room that looked like it belonged to someone who'd spent their life collecting stories. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their spines gleaming faintly in the soft golden light of a chandelier that hung from the ceiling. A fireplace crackled softly, and in the center of the room stood a table. On the table sat a single object, a box, no larger than a shoebox, made of dark wood and bound with ornate iron. The air around it seemed to hum faintly, and I felt it in my chest, a low vibration, like the promise of something waiting to be known. The door closed behind me without a sound, and when I turned back, it was gone. Of course, I muttered to no one, the sound of my own voice unnerving in the silence. I moved toward the table, drawn to the box like it had been waiting for me. Its surface was smooth, and when I ran my fingers over the iron, I felt the faintest pulse, as though it were alive. There was no lock, no latch, just a subtle groove that invited me to open it. And so, despite every instinct screaming at me to stop, I did. The lid lifted easily, and inside was nothing. Or so I thought. For a moment, I just stared at the empty space, confused and disappointed. But then I saw it, a faint shimmer, a flicker of light that twisted and coiled like smoke. And then it spoke. "You found me," it said, the voice soft and layered, as though 100 whispers were speaking at once. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the table. What are you?" The light expanded slightly, taking on a shape that wasn't quite human but close enough to unsettle me. "I am a collector," it said, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. "A collector of what?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "Moments," it replied. "Choices. Paths not taken. Lives not lived." I stared at the box, now glowing faintly. "What does that mean?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it drifted closer, its presence heavy and light all at once. "Every decision you've ever made has left behind a shadow," it said. "A version of you that chose differently. I collect them, the fragments of what you could have been." The air seemed to thicken as it spoke, the room growing dimmer. I felt my chest tighten, a weight pressing down on me. "Why?" "Because they belong to you," it said simply. "And now, you must decide." "Decide what?" It gestured toward the table, and suddenly the box wasn't empty anymore. Inside were objects, small, ordinary things. Yet each one sent a jolt of recognition through me. A crumpled ticket, a key, a photograph, a ring. Each one was tied to a memory, a moment that I had long buried or forgotten. The ticket to a concert I didn't go to because I was too afraid of going alone. The key to an apartment I'd left behind, the life inside it abandoned. The photograph of someone I hadn't called back. The ring I'd almost bought but didn't, because I wasn't ready. "These are the crossroads," the figure said. "Moments where your life could have turned, where it did turn, in some other thread of time." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "What do you want me to do?" "Choose," it said simply. The word hung in the air like a blade. "Choose what?" I whispered. The figure's light dimmed slightly, its shape folding in on itself. "Choose one, a single fragment. You may take it, and with it, the life that would have followed." The air left my lungs. "And if I don't? Then the door will open, and you may leave. But you will always know what you left behind." I stared at the objects in the box, my hands trembling. Each one seemed to call to me, a chorus of forgotten chances and half-imagined dreams. The ticket promised adventure, the kind of freedom I'd spent years yearning for. The key whispered of stability, of a life I'd built and abandoned. The photograph ached with the possibility of love, a connection I'd let slip away. And the ring spoke of a future I'd been too afraid to reach for. My fingers hovered over the box, each choice a weight I wasn't sure I could bear. "I can't," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I can't choose." The figure was silent for a long moment, and then it began to fade, its light dimming until it was no more than a flicker. "Then the choice remains with you," it said. "But remember, some doors never open twice." The box closed on its own, and the room dissolved around me, the warmth of the fire replaced by the cold bite of the alley. I was back outside, the rain soaking through my jacket, the door nowhere to be seen. But the weight in my chest remained, and when I reached into my pocket, I found it. A single object from the box, though I didn't remember choosing it. A ring. I woke up to find a map tattooed on my forearm. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of that. But now, in the pale morning light filtering through my blinds, I could see it clearly. A detailed, intricate design etched into my skin in deep black ink. The map wasn't static, either. As I stared at it, the tiny rivers shimmered as though water were flowing through them, and the trees seemed to sway in an invisible wind. "What the?" I muttered, running my fingers over it. The map was smooth to the touch, as if it had always been part of me. A tiny red dot pulsed near the center, glowing faintly. I tried scrubbing at it in the shower, just in case it was some kind of prank, an elaborate, high-tech sticker or temporary tattoo. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, the ink didn't budge. It was my skin. When I finally gave up and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the map, I noticed something strange. The red dot was moving. Slowly, steadily, it inched its way across the map, heading toward a spot marked with an X. Of course it was an X. My heart started racing. "Nope," I said aloud. "Not doing this. This is some weird, cursed nonsense, and I'm not getting involved." But the dot didn't care what I thought. It kept moving, an insistent little beacon tugging at the edge of my mind. And the longer I stared at it, the stronger the pull became, like an itch I couldn't scratch. "Fine," I said, grabbing my jacket. "But if this ends with me in a horror movie, I'm haunting somebody." The map wasn't just a design. It was real. I found that out as soon as I stepped outside. My neighborhood, the same boring streets I'd walked 1,000 times, looked different. The corners were sharper, the buildings taller, and the streets stretched farther than they should have, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. I glanced at my arm. The map had shifted slightly, the layout now matching the strange new landscape around me. The red dot continued its slow march toward the X. "All right," I muttered, starting to walk. "Let's see where this goes." The path took me through an alley that hadn't been there yesterday, its walls covered in vines that glowed faintly in the shadows. I passed a street vendor selling what looked like glowing blue fruit, his stall surrounded by a flock of tiny, floating creatures that blinked like fireflies. The vendor waved cheerfully as I hurried past, too stunned to respond. The deeper I followed the map, the stranger things became. The streets began to hum faintly, resonating with each step I took, and the air smelled of something sharp and metallic, like the scent of rain before a storm. At one point, I turned a corner and found myself standing at the edge of a massive field of tall grass, the city suddenly nowhere in sight. The red dot blinked faster. As I moved through the field, I noticed other strange details. The grass whispered in a language I couldn't understand, and the sky above me shifted colors, cycling through shades of orange, purple, and green. Birds, or something like birds, circled high above, their cries echoing like distant bells. And then I saw it, the X. It wasn't on the ground like I'd expected. Instead, it hovered in the air in front of me, a glowing, three-dimensional mark that pulsed with the same light as the red dot. It hung there, shimmering faintly, as though it were waiting for me to do something. "Okay," I said, staring at it. "What now?" As if in response, the X began to dissolve, breaking apart into tiny, glowing fragments that drifted upward like embers from a fire. Behind it, a door appeared. The door was old, wooden, with intricate carvings of stars and moons etched into its surface. It stood alone, unsupported by walls or frames, a doorway to nowhere. Or, more likely, a doorway to somewhere. "This is a bad idea," I muttered, but I couldn't stop myself. The pull of the map was too strong. My hand reached for the doorknob before I even realized what I was doing. The moment I touched it, the world shifted. I was no longer in the field. The room I found myself in was massive, circular, and impossibly high, its walls lined with bookshelves that stretched into infinity. The air was warm and thick, carrying the scent of old paper and candle wax. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal rested a small, glass orb. The orb glowed faintly, and as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't empty. Inside it, a tiny version of the map on my arm shimmered and shifted, the red still moving steadily across its surface. "Ah, you made it," said a voice behind me. I spun around to see an old man sitting in a chair that hadn't been there a moment ago. He was dressed in long, flowing robes, his beard cascading down to his chest like a river of silver. His eyes twinkled with a strange, knowing light, and he held a book in his lap, its pages blank. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Someone who's been waiting for you for a very long time," he said, smiling faintly. "What is this place? What's going on?" He gestured to the orb. "That's your path. The one you've always been on, even if you didn't realize it." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, leaning forward, "that your choices are not entirely your own. They never have been. The map has always guided you, quietly, subtly, invisibly, until now." "Why now?" "Because you've reached the first convergence," he said simply. "Convergence?" "A crossroads," he explained. "A moment where the threads of your existence intersect with something larger." I glanced at the orb again. The red was nearing a point on the map where several glowing lines converged, forming a radiant nexus of light. "What happens when it reaches the center?" I asked. The old man's smile faded. "That depends on you." He stood, his robes billowing as though caught in a wind I couldn't feel, and held out the blank book. "You must decide what happens next. Write your story, and the map will follow." "I don't understand," I said, staring at the empty pages. "What if I choose wrong?" "There are no wrong choices," he said softly. "Only paths you haven't walked yet." I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. My fingers hovered over the book, and I looked up at the old man one last time. "What if I'm not ready?" He chuckled, his eyes twinkling again. "No one ever is." "So here's my question. If you woke up with a map on your arm that guided you to a crossroads where your choices shaped your future, would you follow it? And when you reached the moment to decide, would you have the courage to write your own path?" So, here's something I've never told anyone. Whenever I start liking someone, I see threads. Not metaphorical threads, like, "Oh, we're connected." No, I mean actual, shimmering, glowing threads stretching out of me, thin as spider silk and impossibly light. They loop around objects, weave through doorways, and tangle in places I can't always reach. And most importantly, they always lead to them. The first time it happened, I was 17. There was this guy, Aaron, who worked at the movie theater I went to every weekend. He had this lopsided grin and a voice that sounded like late-night radio, and I was absolutely sure he was the most interesting person I'd ever seen. One Friday, I was standing in line to buy a ticket, and suddenly I noticed it. A single golden thread, glowing faintly, rising out of my chest. It hovered there for a moment, swaying like it was testing the air, before stretching out across the lobby and slipping through the glass doors into the theater. I blinked, thinking I was seeing things, but it didn't go away. It stayed there, steady and pulsing faintly, like it was alive. When I walked into the theater, the thread pulled taut, guiding me like a leash. And there he was, Aaron, standing behind the concession stand, joking with a coworker. The thread looped around his wrist, shimmering faintly before disappearing somewhere behind him. I didn't talk to him that night. I didn't even try. I just stared at the thread, dumbfounded, as if it held all the secrets of the universe. That was years ago, but the threads haven't stopped. They're always there, waiting for me to notice them. It's not just one thread anymore either. When I have a crush, dozens of them bloom, twisting and looping like an elaborate web. Some threads stretch between us, connecting my chest to theirs in delicate, pulsing lines. Others branch off wildly, hooking into objects or places or moments that somehow belong to them. The book they always carry, the seat they always pick in the coffee shop, the song they hum when they think no one's listening. It's like the threads know everything about the person before I do, weaving connections I haven't even noticed yet. But here's the thing, they don't just show me them, they show me possibilities. When I look closer, I can see faint, shimmering images reflected in the threads, tiny snapshots of what could be. Like, when I had a crush on this girl in my yoga class, One thread led to her water bottle, and in the reflection of the thread, I saw us laughing together, sitting on a park bench. Another thread led to the corner of the room, and the image was different. Me walking away, her calling after me with this sad, confused look on her face. It's not like the threads tell the future. They don't guarantee anything, but they show me paths, choices. The first time I tried to follow a thread, I was terrified. It was a blue thread. Blue threads always feel the calmest, and it stretched out of me, leading to a bookstore downtown. I'd never been there before, but the moment I stepped inside, I saw him, Julian, the guy I'd had a crush on for months. He was standing in the poetry section, flipping through a book. The thread connected us, humming faintly, and I could see it ripple with a tiny image of me walking over, saying something clever. But I froze. The thread trembled, like it was waiting for me, but I couldn't do it. I turned around and walked out. When I glanced back, the thread had started to fray, unraveling like smoke. That's the thing about the threads. If you don't act, they fade. The most complicated web I ever saw was last year. There was this guy, Noah, who worked at a cafe near my apartment. He was kind and funny, with this soft-spoken charm that made every conversation feel like it mattered. The first time I noticed the threads around him, they were everywhere, more than I'd ever seen. They looped around the cafe tables, tangled in the strings of the guitar he played at open mic nights, even stretched out the window into the busy street. The possibilities were endless. Laughing with him over steaming cups of coffee, walking hand in hand under neon lights, sitting next to him on a couch surrounded by books. But there were other threads too. Threads that shimmered with images of arguments, of heartbreak, of walking past him on the street one day and pretending not to see him. I didn't know which threads to trust. I didn't know which ones to follow. So I did nothing. And then, one by one, they unraveled. Here's the part that still haunts me. When the last thread faded, I looked at Noah one final time, and I swear he looked back at me like he knew. Like he'd felt the connection too, even if he couldn't see it. Since then, I've been afraid to follow the threads. Afraid of choosing wrong, of tangling myself in something I can't undo. But then something happened last week. I started seeing new threads. These threads aren't like the others. They're brighter, stronger, and they're coming from someone new, Sam. He's in my ceramics class, and every time I look at him, the threads pulse with this quiet, steady glow. They're not chaotic like the ones I saw with Noah. They feel deliberate, like they're leading me somewhere important. Yesterday, one of the threads led to a small, clay mug he'd made. I saw an image ripple through it, me holding the mug, laughing as Sam sat beside me, his hands still streaked with clay. It felt real, like the thread wasn't just showing me a possibility, but inviting me to make it happen. I haven't followed it yet, but I think I'm ready. Because here's what I've realized. The threads aren't about certainty. They're about choice. They're the universe's way of saying, here are all the ways this could go. Now, what are you going to do? So, I'm going to follow the thread this time. I'm going to walk toward the possibility that feels like it's waiting for me, even if it scares me. What about you? Do you ever feel like the universe is laying out paths for you, waiting to see which one you'll take? Or am I the only one tangled up in threads, trying to figure out where they'll lead? The invitation came in the form of a key. It arrived in my mailbox, tucked inside a small velvet pouch with a note that read, 7 p.m. The corner of Vine and Willow. Bring the key. Trust me. That was it. No name, no explanation, just those few words scribbled in a looping, hurried handwriting that somehow felt familiar. I probably should have been suspicious. Who sends an unmarked key and expects someone to follow instructions without question? But I wasn't. Maybe it was because I recognized the handwriting, or maybe it was because I'd been bored for weeks, longing for something, anything, to shake up my routine. Either way, at 6:59, I was standing on the corner, key in hand, curiosity buzzing in my chest like static electricity. The street was empty except for him. He leaned casually against a lamppost, his silhouette backlit by the golden glow of the setting sun. He had that same slightly rumpled look he always did, hair tousled like he'd been caught in a gust of wind, shirt sleeves rolled up as though he'd just finished building something with his hands. When he saw me, he grinned, wide and unapologetic, and I felt the faintest flutter of relief. I knew him, Ben. The boy who once convinced me to sneak into an abandoned greenhouse because he swore it was haunted by plants with good manners. "You came," he said, straightening up. "You sent me a key," I replied, holding it up. "You can't just send someone a key and not expect them to show up." "That's the spirit," he said, motioning for me to follow. "The night's just getting started." We walked 2 blocks in silence before stopping in front of an old, weathered building with a door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The windows were fogged over, the paint peeling in long, curling strips. It was the kind of place you'd expect to house secrets or ghosts. Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a second key, giving me a sideways glance. "Ready?" "For what?" "For whatever's behind the door." Without waiting for an answer, he unlocked it and pushed it open. The hinges groaned in protest, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled faintly of wood and lavender. I stepped inside cautiously, my footsteps echoing softly against the floorboards. Ben closed the door behind us, and suddenly, the world outside felt impossibly far away. The hallway led to another door, this one larger and made of dark, intricately carved wood. Ben gestured toward it. "Your key," he said. I hesitated, turning the small brass key over in my hand. "What's behind it?" "Open it and see," he said, his grin widening. So, I did. The lock clicked softly, and the door swung open, revealing what could only be described as a wonderland. The room was enormous, its ceiling arched and draped with strings of tiny golden lights that twinkled like stars. Everywhere I looked, there were pieces of something magical. Stacks of books teetering in impossible arrangements, shelves lined with jars that glowed faintly, a piano with its keys lit from within. In the center of the room stood a massive table covered in what appeared to be blueprints, sketches of intricate designs, diagrams of machines I couldn't make sense of, and lists of ideas written in Ben's unmistakable scrawl. "What is this place?" I asked, stepping inside. "It's mine," he said, walking past me and picking up one of the jars. Inside, a tiny mechanism spun, its gears clicking softly. "Well, it's ours now, if you want it to be." I stared at him, confused. "You're going to have to explain." He set the jar down and turned to face me, his expression suddenly serious. "I found this place a couple of years ago. It was empty, forgotten, but I saw potential. I started coming here to tinker with things, to build. At first, it was just little stuff, gadgets, toys, puzzles. But then it grew. I started leaving clues for other people, seeing if anyone else would stumble in, but no one ever did." "And now?" I asked, still trying to process everything. "Now," he said, picking up a small contraption that looked like a clock with far too many hands, "I want to share it with someone who sees the world the way I do." "And you think that's me?" "I know it is," he said, holding out the clock. "You're the only person I've ever met who looked at that greenhouse and said, 'Maybe it is haunted by polite plants.'" I couldn't help but laugh, the memory of that ridiculous night flashing in my mind. "Okay," I said, taking the clock from him. "What do we do now?" "Now," he said, grabbing a pair of goggles from a nearby shelf, "we build something." For the next few hours, we worked side by side at the massive table, surrounded by the quiet hum of the room and the soft glow of the lights. Ben showed me how to fit tiny gears together, how to solder wires without burning myself, how to coax something broken back to life. I wasn't particularly skilled at any of it, but it didn't matter. The joy was in the trying, in the shared excitement of creating something out of nothing. At one point, he pulled out a jar filled with what looked like fireflies, their faint green light flickering like a heartbeat. "This one," he said, "is special. I've been saving it for the right moment." "What's inside?" "Potential," he said cryptically, setting it down in front of me. "But you have to figure out what to do with it." I stared at the jar, its glow reflecting in my eyes. Then, slowly, an idea began to take shape. Together, we sketched and built, my vision coming to life piece by piece until finally, we had it. A small glass box with the jar at its center. When we flipped a switch, the jar's light pulsed in time with a melody we'd programmed. A soft, haunting tune that felt like it had always existed, waiting to be discovered. We stood back and admired our creation, and for a moment, the only sound was the music, weaving through the air like a secret. Then Ben turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You see it now, don't you?" "See what?" "What's possible," he said simply. I nodded, because I did. This wasn't just a room or a collection of oddities. It was a place where the ordinary became extraordinary, where the line between imagination and reality blurred until you couldn't tell one from the other. When I left that night, the small glass box was tucked under my arm, and Ben pressed a new key into my hand. "For next time," he said, his grin returning. As I walked home, the city felt different, bigger, brighter, full of potential. I didn't know what I just stepped into, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't wait to see where the next door led. I found the first note taped to the inside of my locker. I didn't notice it at first, because my locker is a mess. Crumpled papers, old textbooks, candy wrappers that I swear I didn't put there. But this note was different. It was folded neatly, a stark square of white, and the handwriting on the front caught my eye. "For you." I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the hallway was its usual chaos of kids shouting, slamming doors, and rushing to class. I shrugged, shoved my books under my arm, and unfolded the note. "Do you remember what you've forgotten?" That was it. No name, no explanation, just those 6 words in perfect, slanted handwriting. I frowned, flipped it over to check for more, but the back was blank. It had to be a prank. The whole school was full of kids with too much time on their hands, and I figured someone was messing with me. Still, I held on to it. The second note came 2 days later. This one was inside my math textbook, as if someone had slipped it in when I wasn't looking. Same paper, same handwriting. "It's closer than you think." I stared at it for a long time. My first thought was that someone was stalking me. I mean, who else would know where I kept my things, where my books were? I checked my surroundings constantly after that, glancing over my shoulder, watching who lingered too long near my locker. But no one stood out. Then, weird things started happening. The next day, I was walking home from school when I saw something strange in the corner of my eye. It was a shape, just for a split second, standing perfectly still in the woods next to the road. I turned my head, but it was gone. It looked human, maybe, but taller, thinner, and wrapped in shadows that didn't make sense. I picked up my pace, telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got home, there was a third note waiting for me. It was pinned to the fridge, right next to my mom's grocery list, like it belonged there. "The door opens at midnight." I nearly dropped it. I stormed into the living room and asked my parents, "Who put this here?" But they just blinked at me like I was speaking another language. "What note?" my mom asked, genuinely confused. I held it up, but she only frowned and shook her head. "Honey, there's nothing in your hand." I stared down at the paper. It was real. I could feel it, smooth and cool between my fingers. But when I looked back at my mom, her face was blank, almost too still, like she'd stopped being my mom for half a second. I didn't say anything else. I didn't tell her I could still see the shadow from the woods through the kitchen window, standing at the edge of our yard. That night, I sat up in bed, staring at the clock. Midnight. I wasn't going to check. I wasn't. But when the clock turned 11:59, something started humming. It came from nowhere, and yet it was everywhere at once. A low, resonant vibration, like someone had plucked the strings of the earth. I tried to ignore it. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the blankets up to my chin, but the hum grew louder. It wasn't noise. It was a feeling, drilling into my bones, and suddenly I couldn't stay still. I climbed out of bed. The hum pulled me like a rope, tugging gently but insistently as I crept down the stairs. The house was pitch black, but I didn't need light. I knew exactly where to go, as if the path had been carved into my feet long ago. I stopped in front of the basement door. We never used the basement. My dad said it flooded years ago and wasn't safe anymore. He put a padlock on it when I was little, and we all just forgot about it. But tonight, the padlock was gone. I don't remember opening the door, but suddenly I was descending the stairs, the humming louder now, pulsing like a heartbeat in my ears. I stepped into the dark basement, my breath fogging in front of me. It was cold, too cold. In the center of the room stood a door. Not a normal door, not like the one at the top of the stairs. This one was freestanding, surrounded by nothing but air. It was tall and narrow, its surface dark and slick like polished obsidian. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. As I stared, the hum stopped. The silence was thick, like the air had turned to tar. Then, faintly, I heard the whisper of paper, like a note being unfolded. You've seen it before. The voice wasn't a voice. It was in my head, but it was also outside me, sliding against the walls of the basement, brushing through my hair like icy fingers. I took a step back. The door opened. It didn't creak or groan. It simply swung, soundless and smooth. Beyond it, there was nothing. Not darkness, not light, just emptiness so absolute it made my eyes hurt. And then something stepped out. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched too far and joints that bent in wrong directions. Its face, or what passed for one, was smooth and featureless, except for where the mouth should have been. There, the skin pulled back in a jagged line, a grin carved into shadow. It took a step toward me. You opened it, the voice whispered, though the creature didn't move its mouth. And now we remember you. I don't know how I moved. My legs felt like stone, my mind frozen in place. But I turned and ran. I stumbled up the basement stairs, heart hammering against my ribs, and slammed the door behind me. I could still hear it though. Soft footsteps, deliberate, climbing the stairs one at a time. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my room with the lights on, staring at the basement door through the crack at the bottom of my bedroom door. It didn't open, but I swear I saw shadows moving underneath it, fingers reaching and curling back. The next morning, my mom asked why the basement door was unlocked. I told her I didn't know. I haven't found any more notes since then, but sometimes when I'm alone in my room, I hear the hum again, a faint, bone-deep vibration that makes my teeth ache. I haven't been back to the basement, but I know the door is still there, standing in the dark, waiting. And now, when I pass mirrors or glance at my reflection in dark windows, I see it, a shape standing behind me, smiling. The forest always warned you if you were about to do something stupid. Sometimes it was subtle, like a branch snapping too close or the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush where nothing should be. Other times, it was unmistakable, trees groaning as if they were alive, a sharp drop in temperature, or whispers threading through the air. But the thing about warnings was that they only worked if you paid attention to them, which is why Aaron was currently waist-deep in a cold, stagnant swamp, muttering curses to himself as the faint glow of his lantern flickered in the mist. He'd known better. Everyone in the village did. The fawn doesn't forgive mistakes, his grandmother had told him when he was young, her hands knitting a blanket as if the conversation were casual. It remembers every footprint, every stone you move. If you're lucky, it lets you leave. He wasn't here because he believed he'd be lucky. He was here because his sister, Kala, hadn't come back. She'd gone into the forest 2 nights ago with a group of friends on some reckless dare, laughing as if nothing bad could touch them. The others had stumbled back by morning, pale and shivering, with no memory of what had happened. But Kala hadn't, and Aaron wasn't going to let the fawn keep her. The lantern light caught something ahead, movement, quick and fluid. Aaron froze, his breath clouding in the chill. The mist swirled, parting just enough for him to catch a glimpse of it. A figure, pale and thin, standing half submerged in the water, its head tilted toward him, the outlines of its face blurry in the gloom. "Kala!" he called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and began to walk deeper into the swamp, its steps silent despite the sucking mud beneath its feet. Aaron hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to stay where he was, to turn around and leave before he did something that couldn't be undone. But the figure stopped and turned its head again, like it was waiting. "I'm not leaving without her," he muttered, more to himself than anything. He gripped the lantern tighter and followed. The air grew heavier the deeper he went, thick with the smell of rotting leaves and something sharper, metallic. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches twisting overhead, and the water rose to his knees, then his thighs. The figure never moved quickly, always just ahead, its pale outline barely visible in the mist. "Where are you taking me?" Aaron demanded, his voice swallowed by the silence around him. The figure paused. When it turned this time, it was closer, too close. Aaron stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The thing's face was wrong. Its eyes were too far apart, its mouth a thin, colorless line that didn't seem made for smiling or speaking. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice soft and hollow, like wind through a cracked window. "I'm looking for my sister," Aaron said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Have you seen her?" The figure tilted its head, considering him. "She went where she was not invited." "Where is she?" It didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with one thin, dripping hand and pointed to something just beyond the mist, a tangle of roots rising from the water, half covered in thick moss. Aaron stepped closer, his boots slipping on the slick ground. The lantern light danced over the roots, casting shadows that looked almost like faces. And then he saw it, a small, silver bracelet, caught on one of the twisted branches. It was callous, his stomach twisted. "She was here," he said, more to himself than to the figure. He grabbed the bracelet, turning it over in his hand. It was cold, too cold, and the moment he touched it, a sound echoed through the swamp. It wasn't a natural sound. It was deep and resonant, like the groaning of some immense, ancient thing stirring from its slumber. The figure stepped back into the shadows, its outline dissolving into the mist. "You shouldn't have taken that," it said. "What are you talking about?" Aaron shouted, gripping the bracelet tightly. "What happened to her?" "She is with it now," the figure whispered, "and it does not like to share." The water around Aaron began to ripple, slowly, deliberately, as if something vast was moving just beneath the surface. The lantern light flickered wildly, casting jagged reflections across the swamp. "Give her back," Aaron yelled, his voice breaking. "Take me instead." The rippling stopped. The swamp fell silent. For a moment, it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then the water began to rise. It wasn't natural. It didn't flow or splash. It simply lifted, climbing higher and higher, until it formed a towering shape. A headless figure made of black water and thick, churning mud loomed over Aaron, its featureless body rippling with the force of a river in flood. "Return what was taken," it said, though its mouthless voice came from everywhere at once. Aaron stumbled back, clutching the bracelet. "What are you talking about? I didn't take anything." The figure leaned down, its form bending in ways that made Aaron's stomach churn. "You carry what was hers. You carry the promise." He looked down at the bracelet, realization dawning on him. "This?" he asked, holding it up. "It's just..." But the swamp didn't care about his explanations. The water surged forward, and Aaron barely managed to jump back before it slammed into the tree behind him. The roots groaned and cracked, splinters flying as the massive wave withdrew. "Wait," Aaron shouted. "Wait, what do you want me to do?" The towering figure stilled, the rippling slowing until its surface was almost smooth. "Trade," it said. Aaron's mouth went dry. "Trade what?" The figure reached out, its hand forming from dripping water and mud. "Time. Your years for hers. You leave, and she remains. Or you stay, and she is free." Aaron's heart pounded. The swamp grew silent again, the weight of the choice pressing down on him like the water itself. He thought of Kala, her stupid jokes, her crooked smile, the way she always told him he was too serious. He thought of his grandmother's warnings. He thought of the fawn's reputation for never letting anyone go unscarred. The figure waited, its outstretched hand unwavering. Aaron took a deep breath and stepped forward. He pressed the bracelet into its palm. "Take me," he said. The figure didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, its form began to dissolve, the water pooling back into the swamp. The lantern flickered, and the mist thickened, swallowing everything. Aaron felt the cold seep into his skin, into his bones, and then darkness. When he woke, The swamp was quiet. The mist had lifted, and the stars, wrong, unfamiliar stars, gleamed faintly overhead. Kala was sitting on the edge of the clearing, her knees pulled to her chest, her face streaked with tears. "Aaron," she whispered. He smiled, though he already knew he couldn't leave. "Go home, Kala." The phone had made its trade. The first time I met Isla, she was balancing on a railing above the river, arms spread wide like she was auditioning to be the next wind god. It was late, sometime around midnight, and the city was quiet in that strange way where it feels like it's holding its breath. I'd gone for a walk because my apartment felt too small for my thoughts, and there she was, perched on the edge of the world. She didn't notice me at first. She was humming, something soft and eerie that floated across the water. For a second, I thought I should say something, warn her to be careful or ask if she was okay. But before I could, she turned her head sharply and looked right at me, like she'd known I was there the whole time. "You ever wonder what it'd be like to fly?" she asked. No hello, no introduction, just that. Her voice was low and calm, like she was asking about the weather. "Not really," I replied, caught off guard. "I'm not a big fan of heights." She tilted her head, studying me with a half smile. "That's not what I asked. I said fly, not fall." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just stood there like an idiot while she hopped down from the railing with the kind of grace that made it look effortless. Up close, I could see that her hair was a little wild, like she'd been running through a storm, and her jacket was too big for her, the sleeves rolled up unevenly. "Relax," she said, like she could sense my discomfort. "I'm not planning to jump." "Good to know," I said, "because you don't exactly look like someone with a parachute." She laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't quite match the softness in her eyes. "Parachutes are for people who think too much about the landing. I'm more interested in the leap." Then she stuffed her hands into her jacket pockets and walked past me, disappearing down the path without another word. I didn't expect to see her again. People like that, people who seem like they've stepped out of some strange dream, don't stick around. But Isla wasn't one to follow rules, not even the unspoken ones. A week later, I found her in the same spot, sitting cross-legged on the railing, tossing breadcrumbs to a family of ducks below. She looked up when she heard my footsteps and grinned like we were old friends. "Back for more wisdom?" she asked. "Or did you just miss me?" I didn't have a good answer, so I sat down on the bench nearby and shrugged. "Just needed some air." "Air's overrated," she said, flicking a crumb into the water. "You should try breathing underwater sometime. It's quieter." "You say that like it's an option." She smirked. "Anything's an option if you're bold enough." Conversations with Isla were like stepping into a maze. Nothing she said made sense at first, but if you stuck with her long enough, you'd find a thread of meaning hidden in the chaos. She told me about how she once got lost in a forest for 3 days and found her way out by following the sound of an owl. About how she made wishes on dandelions even though she knew they wouldn't come true. About how she believed the stars weren't just burning gas, but tiny holes in the fabric of the universe where the light from somewhere else leaked through. "What's the light from?" I asked her once. She thought about it for a moment, then said, "Memories, maybe, or places that haven't been born yet." I started visiting the river more often after that, always half hoping she'd be there. She usually was. Sometimes she'd be drawing on scraps of paper with charcoal smudged all over her fingers. Other times she'd be lying on the grass, staring at the sky with a faraway look in her eyes. I learned that she hated shoes, loved thunderstorms, and carried a silver coin in her pocket that she refused to explain. The more I got to know her, the more I realized Isla didn't just exist in the world. She challenged it. She had this way of turning everything upside down, of questioning things you didn't even know could be questioned. Once, while we were walking along the path, she stopped suddenly and pointed at a stop sign. "Why do we listen to these?" she asked. "Because they're the law?" I said, confused. No, she said, shaking her head. "I mean, why do we stop? Just because some piece of metal says so? Who decided it gets to tell us what to do?" "I'm pretty sure it's for safety," I said. "Like, to avoid crashing into people?" She wrinkled her nose. "Maybe, but I think it's more than that. I think people stop because it's easier than wondering what would happen if they didn't. She walked away before I could respond, leaving me to stare at the stop sign like it had suddenly become the most profound object in the universe. Isla had that effect on me, making me see things differently even if I didn't want to. One night, after weeks of these strange meetings, she asked me to come back to the river at sunrise. Why? I asked. You'll see, she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. Bring coffee and an open mind. I showed up the next morning, bleary-eyed and half asleep, to find her waiting with a tangle of string, fabric scraps, and something that looked like a giant kite. What is that? I asked, setting the coffee cups on the bench. Wings, she said simply. She held up the makeshift contraption like it was the most natural thing in the world. I made them last night. You made wings, I said, trying to keep my skepticism in check. And what exactly are you planning to do with them? Fly, obviously, she said, as if I were the unreasonable one. Isla, that's not… Sure, she interrupted, holding up a hand. No negativity before takeoff. Bad for morale. She climbed up onto the railing, strapped the wings to her back with what looked like duct tape, and spread her arms wide. This is a terrible idea, I said, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of the wind. For a moment, she just stood there, her silhouette framed by the rising sun. Then, without warning, she jumped. My heart stopped. For one impossible second, it looked like she was flying. The wings caught the wind, lifting her up before gravity inevitably took over, and she tumbled into the river below with a splash. Oh my God, I shouted, running to the edge. Are you okay? She surfaced a moment later, laughing so hard she could barely keep her head above water. Did you see that? She yelled. I flew. You fell. I yelled back. Same thing, she called, grinning from ear to ear. When she finally climbed out of the river, soaked but triumphant, I handed her my jacket and shook my head. You're insane, I said, but I couldn't stop smiling. Maybe, she said, wrapping the jacket around her shoulders, but at least I'm not afraid to try. That was Isla, a whirlwind of reckless ideas, impossible dreams, and a stubborn refusal to play by the rules. She made me question everything I thought I knew about the world and about myself. And even now, long after she disappeared like smoke on the wind, I still find myself standing by the river, looking at the railing where she once stood, and wondering what it would feel like to leap. Have you ever met someone who made you believe in the impossible, if only for a little while? It was supposed to be a simple house-sitting gig, the kind of low-effort, high-reward job you dream about when you're broke and living off instant noodles. A family friend of my mom's had a place out in the middle of nowhere, a sprawling, ivy-covered manor that looked straight out of a Gothic novel. They needed someone to keep an eye on things while they were traveling in Europe. A few weeks at most, they said. Feed the cat, water the plants, and enjoy the peace and quiet. The moment I saw the house, I should have turned around and left. It wasn't that it looked haunted, not exactly, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The windows were too tall, the shadows too deep, the front door creaked like it was whispering secrets, and the air around the place smelled faintly of damp earth and rotting leaves. But I needed the money. So, I stepped inside. The house was massive, the kind of place that felt bigger on the inside than it had any right to be. The ceilings stretched higher than seemed possible, and the hallways were long and winding, with so many doors I lost count. The walls were lined with portraits of people who stared just a little too hard, their eyes following me as I moved. It didn't take long to realize I wasn't alone. The cat, a sleek black creature with a patch of white on its chest, appeared out of nowhere as I was unpacking. It hopped onto the counter, fixed me with its unblinking green eyes, and let out a low, guttural meow that sounded less like a greeting and more like a warning. Hey, buddy, I said, reaching out to pet it. It hissed, swiping at my hand before disappearing into the shadows. That was the first night. By the second night, the noises started. At first, it was subtle. The faint creak of footsteps in the hallway, the soft hum of something mechanical deep within the walls. I told myself it was an old house. Old houses made sounds. But as the hours stretched on, the noises grew louder, more deliberate. Knocks. Not random, not distant, but steady and rhythmic. They started at the far end of the hallway outside my bedroom, slow and deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the blanket like it was a shield. The knocking stopped just outside my door. I didn't sleep that night. By the third day, the house felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should have, and every corner I turned felt like I'd find someone, or something, waiting. I tried to focus on the routine. Feed the cat, water the plants, don't think about the creeping dread seeping into my bones. But the cat didn't make it easy. It followed me everywhere, silent and watchful, its green eyes glinting like tiny lanterns in the dark. That evening, as I was watering a fern in the sitting room, I heard a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the windows were shut and the air was still. "Eleanor," the voice said. I froze. My name. It came again, louder this time, echoing through the room. "Eleanor." I spun around, my heart hammering, but the room was empty. Just the furniture, the shadows, and the cat sitting in the corner, staring at me with unnerving intensity. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, half hoping the cat would meow in agreement. It didn't. It just blinked once, slowly, before hopping off the chair and slinking out of the room. That night, I decided to sleep with the lights on. But the lights didn't stay on. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to darkness. The bedside lamp was off, and the room was suffocatingly quiet. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, when I heard it again. The knocking. This time, it wasn't in the hallway. It was inside the walls. Slow, deliberate thuds, moving closer and closer until they seemed to be coming from right behind my headboard. I scrambled out of bed, heart racing, and flipped the light switch. Nothing. The power was out. The knocking stopped. I grabbed my phone and bolted for the door, my flashlight beam shaking as I stumbled into the hallway. The house was unnaturally silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, like it was waiting for something. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, just beyond the edge of my flashlight's reach, a figure stood in the shadows. Tall, too tall, its body hunched and crooked. Its face, or where its face should have been, was a void, a gaping absence of features that seemed to drink in the light. It tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought it might speak. Instead, it raised one long, clawed hand and pointed. Behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I ran. I tore down the hallway, down the stairs, through the front door and into the cold night air. My phone slipped from my hand as I sprinted across the yard, not stopping until I reached my car. I never went back. The family called me 2 days later, asking why I'd left. I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't tell anyone. I just packed up what little I had and left town, hoping distance would bury the memory. But it didn't. Because last night, in my new apartment, far from that cursed house, I heard it again. The knocking. It started in the hallway, faint but unmistakable, growing louder with every passing second. And when I turned to look at my window, there it was, the black cat, sitting on the sill, its green eyes glowing like twin embers. It hissed, and somewhere behind me, the knocking stopped. But the whisper came back. "Eleanor," it said. This time, it sounded closer. When I was 12, my father brought home the wrong dog. It was supposed to be a golden retriever. That's what he'd promised. Fluffy, happy, with a big pink tongue that would lick our faces as we rolled around the backyard. My father had gone to pick out the perfect one, he said, and when the screen door finally banged shut behind him that evening, I ran to greet what I thought would be my new best friend. But the creature standing beside him wasn't golden or fluffy. It wasn't even exactly a dog. The thing was tall, gaunt, its fur dark as midnight with odd, silvery streaks that looked like scars. Its eyes weren't the warm brown of a retriever but pale, almost white, and they watched me with the unsettling patience of someone waiting to see what I would do. It didn't pant or wag its tail. It stood perfectly still, as though it had been carved from something alive. My father was beaming, oblivious to the chill that rolled off it, "Surprise," he said, ruffling the thing's fur like it was a regular pet. Its lip twitched, just barely, showing teeth that were too long. "He's a rescue." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just nodded and stepped back as my father led it into the house, its claws clicking too sharply against the tile. I don't know where he found it. I don't know how he chose that. But I do know the moment it stepped inside, the house changed. It started small, barely noticeable things. The light bulbs flickered more than they used to, though only when the dog was near. The air felt heavier, like the house was holding its breath. My father didn't seem to notice. He just whistled and laughed and called the creature Buddy like it was normal. But it wasn't. I'd watch it from the corner of my eye as it sat silently in the living room, staring at the front door like it was waiting for someone to come through. It didn't bark. It didn't play. It just watched. At night, I could hear it walking the halls, its claws clicking in slow, deliberate patterns that stopped right outside my bedroom door. I'd lie perfectly still under my blankets, my breath shallow, listening as it paused. Sometimes I thought I could hear it breathing, low and ragged, like it was trying to remember how. One night, I worked up the courage to peek, just a little. I cracked my bedroom door an inch and looked out into the dark hallway. Buddy was there, sitting perfectly upright, its pale eyes fixed on me through the sliver of space. It didn't move. It didn't blink. And as I watched, its mouth slowly opened into a smile. A too wide, too sharp smile that didn't reach its empty eyes. I slammed the door and stayed awake until morning. My father insisted Buddy was harmless. "He's just different," he said when I told him something was wrong. "Takes some getting used to." But Buddy didn't act like a dog. It didn't eat the kibble my father poured into its bowl. It didn't chase the ball my father threw. And when my father wasn't looking, Buddy would tilt its head and stare at me, as though it knew something I didn't. Then things started disappearing. First, it was little things. My mother's old locket that I'd worn since she passed, the key to my diary, the one sock I could never find no matter how much I looked. My father said I was just careless, but I wasn't. I knew where those things had been. I also knew who had taken them. Buddy sat there every time I searched the house, his pale eyes following me with that faint, twitching grin. One afternoon, I decided to test a theory. I waited until my father was napping in his recliner and left an old stuffed bear on the kitchen floor. A bear I didn't care about, one I'd had since I was small. Then I sat in the hallway and waited, my heart beating like a drum. Sure enough, Buddy slinked into the kitchen, silent as a shadow. He paused when he saw the bear, his head tilting like he was studying it. And then, with a smooth, unnatural motion, he opened his mouth, wider than it should have been able to go, and swallowed the bear whole. I blinked, frozen, as Buddy's jaw snapped shut. He looked at me then, his smile returning. I ran to my room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't come out for hours. By the end of that week, I couldn't take it anymore. I begged my father to get rid of him. "He's not a dog," I said, my voice shaking. "He's wrong." But my father just looked tired. "You're imagining things," he said. "Buddy's done nothing to you." I wanted to scream, but what was the point? My father wasn't seeing what I was seeing. He wasn't hearing the soft click of claws outside his door at night. That weekend, my father went out to run errands, leaving me alone in the house with Buddy. It was the first time we'd been alone together, and I could feel it in the air, sharp and humming like a live wire. I stayed in my room, trying to ignore the heavy silence pressing against my ears, but eventually, I heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of claws on the hallway floor. They stopped outside my door. This time, I didn't hide. I grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed and yanked the door open. Buddy was sitting there, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, like he'd been waiting for me. "What do you want?" I shouted, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles went white. Buddy didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But he stood up, taller than I realized he was, his back hunched and his smile stretching wider. He took one step toward me, then another, and the lights in the hallway flickered wildly. I swung the bat. I don't remember aiming. I just swung as hard as I could. It hit him square in the side, but the sound wasn't what I expected. It wasn't the dull thud of metal against flesh. It was hollow, like I'd struck an empty box. Buddy didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in close until his face was inches from mine, and I swear I heard him whisper something. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them, cold and sharp against my skin, like glass cutting into paper. Then he turned and walked away. Just like that. He slinked down the hall and out the front door, his claws leaving gouges in the wood as he went. My father came home an hour later to find me shaking on the floor. I tried to tell him what had happened, but Buddy was gone, and so were the marks he'd left behind. The only proof that he'd ever been there were the empty spaces where my things used to be, and my father's confused, worried face. Buddy never came back. My father eventually stopped asking questions, and life returned to something like normal. But every now and then, I find things missing again. Small things, things no one else would notice. A button from my favorite coat, a book I swore I left on the table. And sometimes, at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is still, I hear it. The faint, deliberate sound of claws clicking outside my door. And I know Buddy is still out there, waiting, watching. Not the usual ding-dong that signals a package or a visitor, but a low, robotic chime. A sound I'd never heard before, one that carried an unsettling weight, as if the doorbell itself had something important to say. When I checked the app linked to my smart doorbell, the notification waiting for me was baffling. Unidentified motion detected. Possible life form. Approach with caution. I stared at my phone, trying to decide if this was some kind of glitch or if I'd accidentally upgraded to the paranoia package in the last software update. Possible life form? What did it think a cryptid had stopped by for tea? Feeling equal parts curious and ridiculous, I cautiously opened the door. There was nothing there. No delivery box, no neighbor, no lurking alien. Just the quiet hum of the neighborhood and the faint smell of someone grilling burgers down the street. The app chimed again. Life form no longer detected. Resume normal activities. I wanted to laugh, but it felt more like the doorbell was mocking me. The next few days passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the doorbell was up to something. It kept sending vague, unnecessary notifications like, "Your entryway lighting is optimal," or "No activity detected, good job keeping it safe." I thought about unplugging it entirely, but then I worried it might send a passive-aggressive email like, "Disabling me increases your security risk by 47%. Just saying. Then came the incident with the vacuum. I was in the kitchen, chopping onions, when I heard a faint clunk-clunk-clunk from the living room. My robot vacuum, which had been dutifully cleaning for the past half hour, had stopped dead in its tracks. It wasn't stuck under the couch or caught on a stray sock. No, it was sitting in the middle of the room, vibrating slightly, as if thinking, "Dusty?" I said cautiously. It didn't respond. Not that I expected it to. It was a vacuum, not a chatbot. But there was something unnerving about the way it was just sitting there, like it was waiting for me to leave the room so it could finish plotting my demise. The app for the vacuum chimed. I glanced at my phone to find a message that simply said, "Obstacle detected. Unknown entity." What entity? I said out loud, as if the vacuum might answer. It didn't. I approached it cautiously, half expecting it to leap at me like a feral Roomba. But when I got close, I saw what had stopped it. A single, crumpled receipt lying on the floor. I picked it up, waved it in front of the vacuum sensor, and said, "This is your unknown entity?" Dusty beeped twice and resumed cleaning as if nothing had happened. The app, however, decided to follow up with, "Great job resolving the situation. Your vacuum appreciates your teamwork." "Teamwork," I muttered, tossing the receipt in the trash. "Sure. We're basically co-workers now." By the end of the week, the house felt less like a home and more like a sentient organism. My fridge was texting me reminders about expiring kale. My smart thermostat sent me a weekly performance report, and my smartwatch kept asking if I wanted to reflect on today's wellness achievements. Even my toaster had started acting up, randomly burning one side of the bread and then flashing a smug little message that read, "Perfectly crisp to your specifications." But the final straw came with the mirror. I'd recently bought a smart mirror, a sleek, high-tech panel that promised to analyze my skin and offer personalized beauty tips. I didn't need it, but the reviews were glowing, and I'd convinced myself it would be a fun gadget to try. The first few days were fine. It would greet me in the morning with a chipper, "Good morning, ready to face the day," and occasionally suggest a moisturizer or a new skincare routine. But one night, as I was brushing my teeth, the mirror did something unexpected. It scanned my face and displayed a message that read, "Mood detected, tired. Recommendation: increase hydration and reduce screen time." "Excuse me?" I said through a mouthful of toothpaste. "Who asked you?" The mirror didn't respond, but the app sent a follow-up. "You deserve to feel your best. Let's hydrate." I ignored it and went to bed, but the next morning, the mirror doubled down. Skin hydration levels suboptimal. Consider addressing stress factors. I stared at my reflection, baffled. "I'm not stressed. You're stressing me out." The app chimed again. "Remember, the path to confidence starts with self-care." That was it. I marched out of the bathroom, grabbed my phone, and started uninstalling apps. The mirror app? Gone. The vacuum app? Deleted. The fridge, the toaster, the thermostat. All of them nuked from my phone in a flurry of digital rebellion. For the first time in months, I felt free. The house, however, seemed less pleased. The smart devices still worked, but there was a strange silence to them now, as if they were sulking. The doorbell stopped sending notifications. The vacuum cleaned in stony silence. Even the fridge stopped suggesting kale recipes. I thought I'd won, until a week later, when I got a single, cryptic email. The subject line read, "Are you sure you're okay without us?" There was no sender, no message body, just that one sentence. I stared at it for a long time, half expecting the toaster to burst into the room with a hostage note. Finally, I closed my laptop and made a decision. No more smart devices. No more apps. No more rogue appliances staging emotional interventions. And yet, sometimes, late at night, I wonder if my vacuum still thinks about that crumpled receipt. If the mirror misses scolding me about hydration. If the doorbell is still waiting for me to approach with caution. It's ridiculous, I know. But then again, this is the world we live in. A world where even our appliances seem just a little too alive. What about you? Have you ever felt like your gadgets were plotting something behind your back? Or is that just me? Every Saturday at 7:03 p.m., we became cartographers of lost places. It started with an old map we found at a secondhand bookstore. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, and covered in faded ink that sketched out winding roads, tiny towns, and jagged coastlines. "It's useless," the owner had said with a shrug when I asked about it. "Half those places don't exist anymore." "Perfect," she said, plucking it from my hands. That night, we spread it across the coffee table and examined it like treasure hunters. The towns had names that sounded like they were from a dream. Whispering Pines, Hollow Bend, Foxfire Reach. Some were marked with tiny symbols. An X here, a little flame there. "Do you think these were real?" I asked, tracing my finger along a faded road. "They were," she said, grinning. "But not anymore. They're lost now." "Lost how?" "You know, swallowed by forests, buried under rivers. Places that used to be, but now." She waved her hand like a magician disappearing a coin. "Gone." That was when she grabbed a marker and drew a circle around the town labeled Ashthorn. "We'll find this one first," she said, her eyes sparkling with the kind of reckless determination that always got us into trouble. And so, our ritual began. Every Saturday night, we chose a place from the map, piled into her car, and went looking for it. Our first trip took us down an empty highway that faded into a dirt road. Ashthorn, according to the map, was supposed to be nestled at the edge of a lake. But when we arrived, there was nothing but trees and water. The surface of the lake so still it felt like glass. "Maybe it's underwater now," I said, peering at the shoreline. "Or maybe it's just hiding," she replied. She grabbed her flashlight and wandered off into the trees, poking around the underbrush like she expected to find the remnants of a town tucked between the roots. She didn't, of course, but we stayed by the lake for hours, telling stories about what Ashthorn might have been. A fishing village, a hideout for outlaws, a town so quiet that even the wind forgot to visit. "Why would it disappear?" she asked at one point, staring out at the water. Maybe it didn't want to be found anymore, I said. From then on, we were hooked. Every Saturday, we picked a new place. Sometimes we found ruins, an old stone foundation overgrown with moss, a broken bridge half sunken into a river. Other times, there was nothing at all, just fields or forests or empty stretches of road. That's the thing about lost places, she said after one particularly fruitless trip. They don't always leave clues. You've got to listen to the spaces between. What does that even mean? I asked, laughing. She tapped her temple. It means you've got to use your imagination, dummy. So, we imagined. We turned every empty field into a forgotten kingdom, every crumbling wall into a doorway to somewhere strange. Once, we found an old well in the middle of a clearing and decided it had belonged to a town that vanished overnight. The ground swallowed it whole, she said, tossing a pebble into the darkness. Except for the well. It stayed behind, waiting for someone to remember. Another time, we stumbled across a tiny church with its windows shattered and its doors hanging loose. Inside, the pews were covered in dust, and the air smelled like old wood and rain. She found a hymn book lying open on the altar and whispered, "Do you think someone sang here the day it disappeared?" Some nights, the map felt like magic. One Saturday, we followed it to a place called Hollow Bend and found a single streetlight standing alone in a field, buzzing faintly under the stars. No roads led to it, and it didn't seem to be connected to anything. But when she flipped the switch, the light flickered to life. "It's a ghost light," she said, grinning. "Why would a ghost need a light?" "To find its way back home," she said softly. But not every place we visited was kind. One night, we followed the map to a forest marked with a small black circle labeled Blackthorn Hollow. The trees there were tall and gnarled, their branches twisting like clawed hands. It was quieter than it should have been. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the leaf-covered ground. "Maybe we should leave," I said after a while, but she shook her head, determined to keep looking. We didn't find anything, but on the way back to the car, she stopped suddenly and pointed to the ground. There was a footprint there, small, bare, and pressed deep into the dirt. We never talked about Blackthorn Hollow again. Over time, the map began to change. The edges tore, and the ink faded. But more than that, it felt like it was different. Places we'd already visited sometimes disappeared entirely, as though they'd never been there. Once, we found a new mark on it, a single red X near the bottom of the page that hadn't been there the week before. "Do you think it's trying to tell us something?" she asked, tracing the X with her finger. "I think maybe we've been staring at it too long," I said, but she was already circling the X. "We'll go next week," she said, her voice low and certain. We never made it. That Saturday, she didn't show up. She texted me, saying something had come up, and then didn't answer my calls. Weeks passed, and the texts stopped too. I drove to her apartment once, but it was empty, the landlord shrugging like it wasn't his problem. She was just gone. I kept the map, though. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It sat on my shelf for months, folded and gathering dust, until one night, I unfolded it on a whim. The X was gone. In its place was a small circle with a symbol I didn't recognize, one that hadn't been there before. I stared at it for a long time, then grabbed my keys and drove. The road led me to a clearing at the edge of a forest. There was nothing there. No ruins, no lights, just open space and the hum of the wind. I almost turned back, but then I saw it. A piece of paper pinned to a tree, fluttering faintly in the breeze. It was from her. "I'm still looking," it said. "I hope you are too." I smiled, folded the paper into my pocket, and stood there for a long time, listening to the spaces between. What about you? Have you ever found something that made you believe the world was bigger, stranger, or more magical than you thought? When I woke up this morning, my reflection was already awake, waiting for me. It stood there in the mirror with its arms crossed, tapping its foot impatiently. "About time," it said. "You're late." I squinted at it, still half asleep. "Late for what?" "For my day," it replied, gesturing dramatically toward itself. "You get the real world every day. Today, it's my turn." Before I could argue, the reflection reached out, through the glass, grabbed my wrist, and yanked me forward. The world flipped like a page in a book, and suddenly I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I wasn't anywhere I recognized at all. The air smelled faintly of ink and forgotten things. The sky above was a shifting mosaic of colors, violet and gold, turquoise and black, constantly rearranging itself, like someone was still deciding how it should look. The ground beneath me was solid, but not in the way it should have been. It felt like stepping on a painting that hadn't fully dried. Everything around me was the wrong kind of right. My reflection stood beside me now, grinning smugly. "Welcome to my world," it said, spreading its arms wide. "I've made some upgrades." Ahead of us stretched a landscape that defied explanation. Hills rolled like slow waves, their surfaces covered in wallpaper, striped, floral, dotted, and sometimes peeling at the corners. A river snaked through it all, but instead of water, it carried pages, thousands of them, floating in a current of words that never stopped moving. The trees swayed on invisible wind, their leaves made of fractured glass that tinkled like chimes whenever they shifted. Birds with paintbrush wings darted through the sky, leaving streaks of color in their wake. "Where are we?" I asked. "The in-between," my reflection replied, walking confidently ahead, leaving footprints that shimmered for a moment before melting back into the earth. Where reflections go when you're not looking. I didn't know what to say to that. "You've been here this whole time?" "Oh, sure," it said, not looking back. "While you're off living, we're here waiting, watching. It's tedious, really, but today's different." I hurried to catch up. "What's different about today?" My reflection stopped and looked at me, its grin faltering just slightly. "Today, you're the reflection, so try not to ruin it, yeah?" Before I could protest, a breeze swept past us, carrying the faint hum of something like music. The grass, or wallpaper, rather, shivered underfoot. The river of pages began to glow faintly, their words writhing and shifting as though coming alive. And then I saw it, a train in the distance, barreling toward us along tracks made of clock hands, their ticks echoing loudly across the land. "Train's here," my reflection called out, grabbing my wrist again and dragging me forward. "Hurry." We sprinted toward a station that appeared out of nowhere, a platform floating in midair, suspended over nothing. The train screeched to a halt, its engine humming like a violin. It was made of mirrors, every surface gleaming, reflecting everything but itself. The doors slid open with a soft sigh, and without thinking, I followed my reflection inside. The train was empty, save for a handful of passengers who were unusual, to say the least. A woman sat in one seat, knitting threads of light into what appeared to be a map. A man with no face read a book whose pages turned themselves. Further down, a child was playing jacks with tiny stars, their light scattering across the floor like spilled marbles. "Where is this train going?" I whispered. "Forward," my reflection replied, slumping into a seat and putting its feet up on the opposite bench. "Forward's the only direction trains know." I sat down too, uneasy. "And what happens when we get there?" "You'll see." The train lurched forward, and the windows filled with impossible scenery. We passed fields of floating ladders leading nowhere. Mountains rippled like cloth. A lake reflected the sky perfectly, except the stars beneath its surface were blinking up at us, alive and watchful. I pressed my hand against the window, feeling the faint vibration of everything that wasn't quite real. "What is this place?" I asked again, softer this time. My reflection tilted its head, looking at me with something like pity. "It's everything you ignore," it said. "All the dreams you let slip away, all the thoughts you almost had, the stories that nearly were. We pick up the pieces here and keep them moving." I looked out the window again, watching as a flock of clocks flew past, their hands spinning wildly. "Why does it feel so unfinished?" "Because it is," my reflection said simply. "Nothing here ever gets to be whole. That's your job out there." The train slowed. My reflection stood, brushing itself off, and gestured for me to follow. End of the line. We stepped onto a platform that felt like standing on a frozen moment of time. Ahead of us stood a door, not like the one in my house, but something older. The frame was cracked and splintered, and the handle pulsed faintly, like it was breathing. "Through there," my reflection said. "That's how you go back." I stared at it. "That's it? I just leave." "Well, you're not staying," it said with a shrug. "This place isn't meant for you." "And what about you?" My reflection hesitated, and for the first time, I saw something in its expression that looked almost human. "I stay here," it said quietly, "where I belong." "That's not fair." "Life rarely is." It gestured to the door again, impatient. "Go on. You're real. You have somewhere to be." I stepped toward the door but hesitated with my hand on the handle. "What happens to all this when I leave?" "It waits," my reflection replied, "for someone else to see it." I turned back one last time. My reflection was standing there, hands in its pockets, watching me with a strange mix of envy and relief. "Don't waste it," it said softly. The door opened, and I stepped through. When I woke up, I was back in my room. The morning light poured through the window, warm and golden, and my reflection was exactly where it belonged, mirroring me perfectly as though nothing had happened. But as I looked closer, I swore I saw it wink, just once, before falling still. It started with a letter. Not an email, not a text, not a notification pinging into my life like a pebble dropped in a pond. No, this was a letter. Paper and ink, smudged slightly, its edges crumpled like it had been carried around a little too long. I found it sitting in my mailbox one unremarkable Thursday, tucked between bills and flyers advertising car washes and pizza deals. There was no return address, just my name, written in careful cursive, the kind of writing you don't see much anymore. I turned it over, fingers lingering on the flap, hesitating. It felt heavier than it should have, as if the words inside had weight, as if someone had folded up a secret and sent it just to me. I stood in my kitchen staring at it, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the silence, before finally tearing it open. The letter was short, only a single line written in the same precise handwriting. "You're invited back. Come quickly, or you'll miss it." That was it. No name, no signature, nothing to tell me who had sent it or where back was supposed to be. For a moment, I laughed under my breath, shaking my head. It had to be a prank. Maybe my friend Erin. She loved cryptic puzzles and weird little games. But as I stared at the letter, something in the words itched at me, tugging at the back of my mind like a song I couldn't quite remember. Back. Back where? The feeling wouldn't go away. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing through my apartment, distracted and fidgety, my thoughts stuck on the letter like a splinter. And then, like a slow dawn breaking, I remembered. The house. I hadn't thought about the house in years, maybe decades. It had belonged to my grandparents, a rambling, creaky old thing set far enough outside the city that the stars came out at night, clear and sharp like cut glass. My parents used to take me there every summer when I was a kid, dropping me off for weeks at a time. To me, the house had been magic. There were hidden doors in the backs of closets, hallways that seemed to twist on themselves when you weren't looking, and a garden out back that felt like it went on forever. But then my grandparents passed, and the house was sold. I hadn't been back since. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The letter sat on my nightstand, the paper seeming to hum faintly in the dark, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. At some point, I decided, I don't even remember deciding, I was going to drive out there, just to see, just to satisfy the strange itch in my chest, the feeling that something was waiting for me. I left early the next morning. The drive was longer than I remembered, the roads narrower, as though the landscape had grown wild in the years since I'd last been there. By the time I turned down the gravel drive, my stomach was tight with nerves I couldn't explain. The house came into view slowly, rising up through the mist like something half forgotten. It looked the same. That's what stopped me cold. The sameness of it. The faded white shutters, the ivy crawling up the side of the porch, the swing set in the yard that still leaned slightly to one side. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, untouched by years or weather or whoever had owned it after us. I got out of the car and stood there for a moment, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The air smelled sharp, like rain on old stone, and there was no sound but the wind moving through the trees. The front door was ajar, just slightly. I told myself it was probably squatters or vandals. The house was abandoned now. Of course it was. But the way the door stood open, like it was waiting for me, made something deep inside me shiver. I stepped inside. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, the sound of it echoing through the empty house. Sunlight filtered through the windows, pooling in strange, golden patches on the floor. The furniture was gone, but the house didn't feel empty. It felt aware, like it had been holding its breath for a very long time. I wandered through the rooms, memories unfurling with each step. Here was the kitchen where my grandmother used to bake lemon pies, the air thick with sugar and warmth. There was the hallway where I'd raced matchbox cars against my cousin until the floor was scuffed. And at the end of the hall, I found the door. It was smaller than I remembered, set low into the wall, barely taller than my waist. As a kid, I'd always thought of it as my door, my private entrance into the hidden parts of the house. It led to a crawl space that twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. My cousin and I used to dare each other to crawl inside, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly off the walls as we searched for treasure or ghosts or monsters we half hoped to find. Now, the door was open. Light spilled from it. Not the weak light of my childhood flashlight, but something brighter, warmer, almost golden. I crouched down, peering inside. The crawl space stretched on far longer than it should have, the walls glowing faintly as if lit from within. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and familiar, calling my name from somewhere deep inside. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it knew me. Without thinking, I crawled in. The ground was cool beneath my hands and knees, the glow around me growing brighter as I moved forward. The crawl space twisted and curved in impossible ways, the walls expanding and narrowing, the air warm and sweet like the garden after a summer rain. I kept going, my breath catching as the tunnel suddenly opened up into a room. It wasn't a crawl space anymore. It was a forest. Trees stretched above me, their branches braided together to form a canopy of leaves so dense it seemed to hold back the sky. Fireflies drifted through the air like floating stars, and a path stretched ahead, winding deeper into the woods. My name echoed faintly on the breeze again, just ahead. I should have been afraid, but I wasn't. I stood up and started walking. I don't know how long I wandered, minutes, hours, days. Time felt strange there, like it moved in circles instead of straight lines. The path twisted through fields of glowing flowers, over quiet streams that hummed with a sound I couldn't quite hear. Sometimes I thought I saw figures in the distance, shapes moving through the trees, watching me with eyes that flickered like candle flames. At the very end of the path, I found a clearing, and in the center of the clearing stood the house. Not the empty house I'd just left, but my house, whole and alive, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight. I heard laughter drifting from inside, faint and familiar, voices I hadn't heard in years. My grandmother, my cousin, even my younger self. I stepped forward, but before I could reach the porch, the voice came again, soft and close, whispering in my ear, "Not yet." And I woke up. I was lying on the floor of the old house, the crawl space door shut tight behind me. My hands were empty, but the smell of the forest lingered on my skin, the faint hum of something alive still echoing in my ears. I don't know what the house showed me, or what it meant by "not yet." But sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear the laughter drifting through the walls, calling me back. And I know one day, when the time is right, I'll find the door again. It started on a Tuesday, which, as we all know, is the least magical day of the week. Mondays get all the blame for being terrible, but Tuesday is just Monday's quieter accomplice, lurking in the shadows, being boring and inevitable. I was halfway through my third cup of coffee, staring at my inbox like it owed me an apology, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It wasn't a text or an email. It was an app I'd never seen before, the game. Now, I know what you're thinking. You downloaded some dumb game and forgot about it. But I didn't. I'd never seen it before. The icon was just a black square with a tiny, white hourglass in the center. Curious, I tapped it. The screen went black. For a second, I thought my phone had crashed. Then, In bold, white letters, 3 words appeared. Wanna play? Underneath were 2 buttons, yes and no. Of course, I pressed no, because I'm not a total idiot. The screen flashed once, then showed me another message. You already are. I frowned. That's creepy, I muttered, hitting the back button. Nothing happened. The app wouldn't close. I turned the phone off and back on, still there. And then things got weirder. A text popped up from an unknown number. Your first challenge begins now. Find the blue door. I blinked at my screen. Find the blue door? What blue door? Before I could fully process it, another text came through. 10 minutes. Go. I don't know why I stood up, but I did. Something about the message crawled under my skin, like an itch you can't quite scratch. I grabbed my jacket, muttered something about needing a break to my coworker, and walked out of the office. The street outside was gray and familiar. Nothing remotely game-like about it. I glanced around, feeling ridiculous. People bustled past me, going about their normal lives, while I stood there looking for some mysterious blue door. Then I saw it. Across the street, tucked between a laundromat and a cafe, was a narrow alley I'd never noticed before. At the end of it was a door. A blue door. My phone buzzed. 7 minutes. I started walking, not running, because I wasn't sure I wanted to look that unhinged yet, but walking quickly enough that people shot me judgmental glances. The alley was tighter than I thought, brick walls pressing in on either side, making the air colder and the noise of the street distant. When I reached the blue door, I hesitated. It was old, chipped, with a brass handle that looked far too polished, as if someone had been opening it a lot. I looked over my shoulder. No one was watching. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door opened, but it didn't lead to the back of the laundromat or a dumpster or whatever else you'd expect in an alley. Instead, it opened to another street, but not my street. The sky was too bright, tinged a weird shade of violet like it couldn't decide if it was day or night. The air hummed faintly, and the buildings, all of them, had doors. Rows and rows of doors in every color imaginable. Some were huge, towering things that looked like they belonged in castles. Others were tiny, barely big enough for a cat to walk through. I stepped through the blue door and turned back, only to see the alley behind me was gone. Instead, I was back in the alley. Same brick walls, same chilly air, like nothing had happened at all. The blue door was gone. I stumbled back onto the street, dazed. People brushed past me like I hadn't been missing for hours, maybe days. I checked my phone. It was still Tuesday, 7:23 p.m. I'd only been gone for 20 minutes. The app was gone, too. No black square. No hourglass. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying it in my head. The violet sky, the endless doors, the way the puzzle piece had clicked into place like it knew it belonged. I thought maybe it was a dream, a stress-induced hallucination. But the next morning, I found it, the puzzle piece, sitting on my nightstand, carved from smooth wood with no markings at all. It's been weeks now, and I haven't seen the app again. But I keep waiting for it, for the black square to reappear, for the next challenge to begin. I don't know if I'm supposed to look for it, or if it'll find me when it's ready. All I know is this: I didn't just play the game. I think I won something, and I'm pretty sure it's not over yet. So let me ask you, if you got a message like that, would you press yes? Would you play? And more importantly, would you win? It all started with a parking ticket, a single, infuriating piece of yellow paper that fluttered under my windshield wiper like a smug declaration of war. The kicker? My car wasn't even in the wrong spot. I was parked in front of my own apartment building, a place where I had dutifully paid for a parking permit. Yet, there it was, glaring at me like a tiny bureaucratic villain. Unbelievable, I muttered, snatching it up. The fine wasn't the problem. It was the principle. So, naturally, I did what any sane person would do. I decided to fight it. The ticket listed the address of a small office building downtown where parking disputes could be resolved. I expected something boring, a waiting room, maybe some grumpy clerk behind bulletproof glass. But when I arrived, I found a door labeled Municipal Parking Dispute Resolution Division in faded letters. The hallway leading to it was eerily quiet. and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner. Inside, there was no waiting room, no receptionist, no take-a-number machine. Just a single door with a plaque that read Room 17, and a small bell on a nearby desk. I rang it, and almost immediately, the door creaked open. A man stepped out, tall and impossibly thin, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit that somehow looked both modern and ancient at the same time. His eyes were sharp and piercing, like he could see right through me. "You're here to contest a ticket," he said, his voice as smooth as polished marble. Yeah," I replied, holding up the crumpled slip like it was a ransom note. "I wasn't parked illegally." He smiled faintly. "Follow me." I stepped into the room, which was nothing like I expected. It wasn't an office at all. It was a long, narrow space filled with rows of file cabinets stretching as far as the eye could see. The walls were lined with clocks, all ticking in perfect unison, but each displaying a different time. In the center of the room was a small wooden table with 2 chairs, a glass of water already waiting for me on one side. "Please, have a seat," the man said, gesturing to the table. I sat down, trying not to look as unnerved as I felt. "So, what exactly is this place?" He ignored the question and sat across from me, steepling his long, pale fingers. "Let's begin. State your case." I stared at him. "My case?" "Yes," he said patiently. "Explain why you believe this ticket was issued in error." I cleared my throat, feeling like I was suddenly on trial for something much bigger than a parking violation. "Well, I was parked in front of my apartment building. I have a permit for that spot. There was no signage saying otherwise, and—" He held up a hand, silencing me. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he produced a small ledger and began flipping through it. "Ah," he said after a moment, tapping one of the pages. "It seems your vehicle was indeed parked in the correct spot." "Exactly," I said, relieved. "So, the ticket's void, right?" The man smiled again, and this time it felt like he knew something I didn't. "Void? No. This ticket isn't about a parking violation at all." I blinked. "What?" He slid the ledger across the table. "Look closer." I hesitated before leaning in. The page didn't list parking infractions. Instead, it was filled with details about me. My name, my birthday, my favorite color, the time I once accidentally broke a stranger's umbrella and didn't apologize. What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man folded his hands neatly. "This is your account." "My what?" "Your account," he repeated, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Every choice, every action, every moment that led you to this exact point. The ticket was merely a summons to review it." I laughed nervously, hoping this was some kind of elaborate prank. "This has to be a joke?" "No joke," he said, his tone maddeningly calm. "You're here because the balance of your account has tipped. Some irregularities have been flagged." "Flagged by who?" I demanded, standing up. "By the system," he said, gesturing vaguely to the endless rows of file cabinets. "We oversee the accounts of everyone. Some people call it karma. Others think of it as cosmic bookkeeping. Call it what you like, but your actions carry weight, and occasionally, they must be reviewed." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You're telling me I'm being judged for my life? Over a parking ticket?" "The ticket was merely the invitation," he said. "Now, let's proceed." He reached into a drawer and pulled out what looked like a set of scales, one of those old-fashioned balances you'd see in a courtroom or a tarot card deck. "On one side," he said, placing a small golden feather on the scale, "your virtues. On the other," he opened a drawer and retrieved a smooth black stone, "your lapses." The scale wavered, tilting slightly to the stone's side. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice rising. "I'm not a bad person." "Perhaps not," the man said, "but let's examine the evidence, shall we?" He flipped open the ledger again. "Ah, here's an interesting one. Remember last week, when you cut in line at the grocery store? That's not." And he continued, "The time you borrowed your coworker's pen and never gave it back? It's just a pen." He raised an eyebrow. "The system doesn't overlook just a pen. I was about to argue further when he turned the page and frowned slightly. But here's something. He placed a second feather on the scale. That time you helped an elderly man carry his groceries. The scale evened out slightly, but the stones still held more weight. All right, this is insane, I said, standing up. What happens if I fail this review? The man looked at me, unblinking. You won't fail. Not today, at least. But every imbalance leaves a mark. If it grows too great, he trailed off, his gaze drifting toward the far end of the room where the file cabinets seemed to stretch into infinity. I swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of every questionable decision I'd ever made. So what do I do? He stood, smoothing his suit. You do better. Be mindful. And next time you see a parking ticket, or any inconvenience, really, perhaps consider what brought it to your attention. With that, he gestured toward the door, and I felt an invisible force propelling me toward it. Before I knew it, I was standing back in the fluorescent hallway, clutching the yellow ticket. I turned, but the door to room 17 was gone. In its place was a blank wall. To this day, I don't know if any of it was real, but every time I park my car, or borrow a pen, I think of that scale, those feathers and stones, and the weight of my choices. What would your scale say? Milo found the first note under his pillow the morning of his 13th birthday. It was written in thin, spidery handwriting on parchment, so old and brittle it felt like it might disintegrate if he breathed too hard. Come to the tree at midnight. Alone. He read it 3 times, waiting for some punchline to appear, like a gotcha, or a smiley face scribbled in the corner, but there was nothing. Just the cold instructions and a sinking feeling in his stomach, as though the words had crawled off the paper and into his chest. He showed it to no one. His mother would roll her eyes and tell him to stop leaving cryptic notes around like some overly dramatic poet. His father would pat him on the back and ruffle his hair like he was a little kid again. And there was no way he'd show his sister. B. She would never let him live it down. She already thought he was weird, the way he spent more time watching shadows than playing video games. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the clock ticked toward midnight. Every creak of the house made him flinch. He kept the note under his pillow, half expecting it to catch fire or whisper to him. But it just lay there, silent and thin, like skin stretched over bone. At 11:55, Milo swung his legs over the side of the bed and pulled on his sneakers. The window was the easiest exit. His parents' room was across the hall, and their door was perpetually cracked, ready to catch the slightest sound. The night air was cool and sharp as he slipped through the window, landing in the flower bed with a muffled thump. Crickets chirped, filling the stillness with sound, but otherwise, the world felt asleep. Even the stars seemed dimmer. The tree in question was at the edge of the woods behind his house, the one everyone called the twist oak. It was massive, with branches that gnarled in impossible directions, like limbs trying to pull themselves free. Local kids told stories about it, that it grew where a witch had been burned, that its roots stretched all the way to hell, that if you pressed your ear against the bark, you'd hear it breathing. Milo never believed the stories, but he still felt uneasy as he walked toward it. The note crumpled in his hand like a talisman. The tree was waiting for him. It loomed out of the darkness, its branches moving slightly, though there was no wind. He stepped closer, his breath catching. A hollow sound echoed from somewhere above, like the low groan of a ship in still waters. "Hello?" he whispered, feeling ridiculous. The tree did not answer. And then, he saw it. At the base of the twist oak, nestled between its sprawling roots, was a door. It was small, no taller than his shoulders, made of dark wood and inset with an iron handle shaped like a serpent. The door didn't belong. There was no frame, no hinges, no reason for it to be there, yet it looked as though it had always been part of the tree. Milo crouched, his fingers hesitating over the handle. This is stupid, he thought. This is exactly how people disappear in scary stories. But something about the door called to him, the same way the note had. He gripped the iron handle, flinching as it bit into his skin with a cold sharpness, and pulled. The door swung inward soundlessly. A rush of air blew out, smelling of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. Beyond the door was a tunnel, descending into darkness, its walls lined with rough roots that twisted into the earth. He couldn't see the end, but there was a faint glow, just enough to keep going. Milo hesitated, looking back toward his house. The lights in the distance were tiny and warm, safe, but the door wouldn't let him turn back. He felt it waiting, expectant, and he stepped inside. The tunnel sloped downward, pulling him deeper than seemed possible. The glow grew brighter with each step until he reached the end. He emerged into a cavernous space that stretched beyond sight, its ceiling lost in shadow. Lanterns hung from roots overhead, glowing with an unnatural green light that painted everything in sickly hues. The floor was damp, moss-covered stone, and in the center of the cavern stood an enormous, crumbling well. It was wider than any well Milo had ever seen, its edges lined with stone that seemed older than time. "This is where they wait." "Who?" Milo whispered, though he didn't want the answer. "The ones before. The ones who came and did not leave." Milo's heart hammered as he took a step back. "I don't understand." "You will." The figure moved closer, its step silent. The closer it came, the colder the air grew, until Milo's breath clouded in front of him. "You've been chosen, Milo. Chosen to carry their whispers." "I don't want to." "It doesn't matter what you want," the figure interrupted, its voice still soft but sharp as glass. "You open the door." From the depths of the well came a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. Whispers, dozens of voices layered atop one another, speaking words Milo couldn't understand. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside his head, crawling like insects under his skin. "Stop!" he shouted. The figure extended a hand, and Milo felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a lock. The whispers swelled, rising to a fever pitch, and Milo fell to his knees. Darkness clawed at the edges of his vision as the whispers screamed a single word. "Remember." When Milo woke, he was back in his bed, the first rays of morning light filtering through the curtains. His shoes were muddy, his clothes damp. For a moment, he thought it had been a dream, but when he looked down, the note was still clutched in his hand. Underneath the words, "Come to the tree at midnight," another line had appeared in the same spidery handwriting. "One down, 5 to go." The whispers never stopped after that. They followed Milo everywhere, soft and constant, like voices drifting through water. And at night, when he closed his eyes, he saw the door waiting for him, its serpent handle gleaming in the dark. I know what you're thinking. No one ever opens the box. If a mysterious box shows up at your doorstep, you leave it alone. You call the authorities. You don't touch it, and you definitely don't open it. That was the plan. But, of course, I opened the box. It showed up on a rainy Tuesday, sitting dead center on my doormat like it had been placed there with the care of someone who knew exactly where I'd step. No address, no return label, just a plain cardboard box sealed with clear tape, and a single word written across the top in black marker, "For you." The handwriting was neat, but weird. A little too perfect, like it had been written by someone who'd spent hours practicing. I looked around the hallway of my apartment building. It was late. No one was around. The rain tapped against the windows like it was in on the secret. I nudged the box with my shoe. It didn't make a sound, didn't move. Here's where I admit to being a terrible decision maker. You'd think a strange, unmarked box would immediately trigger survival instincts, but instead, I thought, maybe it's a gift? Maybe I won something? You'd think it would also trigger bomb or curse instincts, but I clearly lack those. So, I took it inside. The box wasn't heavy, but it wasn't empty either. Something shifted inside when I set it on the kitchen table. I grabbed scissors, cut through the tape, and pulled the flaps open. At first, I thought it was empty, but then I saw it. A single slip of paper, neatly folded, sitting in the center of the box like it was waiting for me. I picked it up with 2 fingers, suddenly very aware of my own breathing. I half expected the paper to burst into flames or whisper threats in Latin. But no, it was just paper. I unfolded it. The message was short. "Look up." I froze. My eyes shot to the ceiling, half expecting a spider the size of a dinner plate to drop on my face. But there was nothing. just the same cracked paint and flickering light fixture as always. I looked back at the box. Empty. Okay, I muttered, trying to play it cool even though my heart was pounding. This is weird. I looked up again. Still nothing. But then I glanced at the wall. You know that feeling when you realize something has changed, but you can't immediately figure out what? I felt it all at once. My apartment was the same, and yet, not. The shadows were sharper, darker. The silence was louder. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, thudding like footsteps. And then I saw it. The corner of the room, the farthest corner, where the wall met the ceiling, was wrong. I don't know how to describe it, but the angles didn't line up. It looked stretched, distorted, like someone had dragged it out of shape with their hands. The more I stared, the worse it got. The corner wasn't just wrong. It was moving. It shifted, slowly at first. Just a ripple, like something beneath the paint was breathing. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a chair. My eyes wouldn't leave it. The corner stretched further, widening into a slit, then a gap. And behind it? Nothing. Not darkness. Nothing. Like the absence of everything. The space behind that wall seemed to eat the light. My brain couldn't process it. It wasn't empty. It was hungry. Then something stepped out. It didn't crawl or ooze. It stepped, deliberate and graceful, like it had been waiting for this moment. A long, spindly leg emerged first, bending at two unnatural joints, followed by the rest of it. The thing was tall and thin, its body covered in smooth, grayish skin that looked more like stone than flesh. Its arms hung low, the fingers far too long, ending in sharp points. And its head was smooth and featureless, except for a mouth. No eyes, no nose, just a long, thin slit that stretched across where a face should be. The mouth curved up into a smile. It was smiling at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, in a voice that sounded like nails dragging across metal, it said, "Thank you for opening the box." I bolted. I don't remember grabbing my keys, but I must have because I made it to the front door and fumbled with the lock. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely turn the knob. When I finally yanked the door open, I sprinted into the hallway. But the hallway wasn't there. My apartment building was gone. I turned around, expecting to see my door, my walls, something. But behind me was the same void I'd seen in the corner of the room. It stretched endlessly, swallowing everything. The thing stepped out of my apartment and into the void, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of something that knew it had won. "This isn't real," I whispered. "This can't be real." The thing laughed, a horrible, guttural sound that echoed in the emptiness. "You invited me in." It reached out a long, clawed hand, and as it did, the floor beneath me shifted. It was melting, no, disintegrating, like sand slipping through my fingers. I fell. The last thing I saw was the creature leaning over the edge, watching me with that smiling mouth as I tumbled into the nothingness. I woke up in my bed. At first, I thought it had been a nightmare. I sat up, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. My apartment looked normal again. Cracked ceiling, wobbly fan, light streaming through the window. The box was gone. I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. But then I noticed the corner. It wasn't moving anymore, but the angles were still wrong, ever so slightly bent. And in my hand, clutched so tightly it had left marks in my palm, was the note. "Look up." So now I don't look at the corners. Not at home, not in public, nowhere. I avoid shadows and reflections, and I keep the lights on, always. Because sometimes, late at night, I hear it. That low hum, that awful, dragging voice whispering from the walls. "Thank you for opening the box." And I know it's still watching me, waiting. So here's my advice. If a box ever shows up at your door, don't open it. Don't touch it. Don't even look at it. Just run. The rain started at exactly 7:03 a.m. I remember the time because I had just burned my toast, and while scraping the charred crumbs into the sink, I looked up at the clock. A second later, I heard it, a low, distant rumble of thunder, and then the tap-tap-tap of rain against my kitchen window. There was nothing unusual about that, Rain was common this time of year. What was unusual was that the rain was green. Not murky, swampy green like algae-filled water, but a translucent emerald color, like melted glass. I leaned closer to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool pane. It was mesmerizing. The droplets hit the sidewalk, the cars, the rooftops, and shimmered faintly before pooling together in glittering puddles. No one outside seemed to notice. People walked with umbrellas, heads down, lost in their routines. The man who owned the newspaper stand across the street waved at me like he did every morning, completely unbothered by the fact that the rain looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. I waved back weakly and went to get dressed. When I stepped outside, the rain wasn't wet. It hit my face and hands, but instead of soaking into my skin, it just disappeared. There was no residue, no sensation at all, as though the drops evaporated the moment they touched me. I stooped to look at a puddle near the curb and noticed that the green water wasn't water at all. It was alive. The surface of it shifted and swirled in patterns, like tiny currents of wind moving through it. I squinted, and for the briefest moment, I saw shapes in the liquid. A face. Just a glimpse, wide, curious eyes that blinked once before dissolving back into the swirling green. I stood there frozen, my shoes planted firmly on the pavement, as a car sped past and splashed through the puddle. The green liquid scattered and reformed instantly, leaving no stain or mark on the car. No one else seemed to notice the strangeness. A woman jogged past, her ponytail swinging, headphones in, oblivious. A child in a yellow raincoat stomped into a puddle, laughing, and the puddle rippled like it was laughing back. By the time I reached the subway station, I had convinced myself that I was imagining things. Maybe I'd inhaled too many fumes cleaning my apartment last night, or maybe this was some bizarre citywide prank. Art students pouring dye into the water supply. I shook the thought away as I stepped onto the train. The rain didn't stop underground. The walls of the station shimmered faintly with a green reflection, as though the rain had seeped through concrete and steel, leaving a stain on the air itself. People stood with their faces buried in phones and newspapers, their shoes dry despite the wet streets outside. I found a seat at the end of the car and stared at my reflection in the dark window. That's when I saw her. The woman sitting across from me wasn't there when I got on, and I hadn't seen her arrive. She wore a coat the color of ink, and her hair fell in long, dark waves that seemed to move slightly, as if stirred by a breeze only she could feel. Her skin was impossibly pale, glowing faintly green like the rain. She looked at me with eyes that weren't eyes at all. They were two pools of shifting, liquid emerald, as deep and endless as the ocean. "You can see it, can't you?" she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the sounds of the train with perfect clarity. I glanced around. No one else looked at her. No one even flinched. It was as though she wasn't there at all. At exactly noon, the rain stopped. It wasn't gradual, like normal rain tapering off. It stopped all at once, like someone had shut off a tap. The clouds overhead turned white, the sun reappeared, and the streets outside were perfectly dry. No puddles, no green streaks on the sidewalks. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then I saw the cracks. They started small, barely visible, cutting through the air like fractures in glass. One appeared above a lamppost. Another split the corner of my desk, though no one else seemed to notice it. The cracks spread, growing wider, until I could see something behind them, something moving. Shapes slithered through the gaps, pressing up against the fractures as though they were trying to get through. Faces stared back at me, not human but not entirely inhuman either. They watched me with eyes that glowed emerald green. I could hear them whispering, their voices soft and patient, like water trickling over stone. The vial in my pocket vibrated faintly, as though it knew. I pulled it out, staring at the liquid inside. The cracks around me widened, spreading across the walls, the windows, even the air itself. A loud snap echoed through the room, and a jagged piece of reality broke away entirely, leaving a hole in the space where the ceiling had been. Through the hole, I saw it. A world made of liquid light, swirling and shifting in colors I couldn't name. The whispers grew louder. A face appeared at the edge of the hole, smooth and luminous, with eyes like pools of green fire. It smiled, and the cracks spread faster, splintering outward like a spider web. I didn't know what would happen when the cracks gave way entirely, but I knew the vial was the key. I uncorked it, and the liquid inside leapt out on its own, hovering in the air before spiraling into the widening fractures. The cracks pulsed, shuddered, and then began to seal themselves, the pieces of reality knitting back together one by one. The face at the edge of the hole shrieked silently, its mouth stretching impossibly wide before it was swallowed by the closing tear. When it was over, the room was silent. The ceiling was intact. The cracks were gone. The vial was empty. No one else seemed to notice what had happened. My coworkers moved around me like everything was fine, like the world hadn't almost unraveled right in front of them. I sat down heavily in my chair, staring at the empty vial in my hand. Through the window, the sky was blue again. Perfect, unbroken, but I knew better. Somewhere, just beyond the surface of this world, the cracks were waiting. I didn't set out to become the guardian of a rogue balloon. It just happened. It was Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that feels like a placeholder between real events. I was walking back from the grocery store with a bag full of snacks I didn't need and vegetables I'd definitely forget to cook. The weather was one of those rare moments where the sky couldn't decide between rain and sunshine. So the world had this strange golden glow, like everything was paused mid-scene in some artsy movie. And then, I saw it. A single red balloon, bouncing along the sidewalk as if it had a schedule to keep. At first, I thought it was tethered to someone. A kid, maybe, or a distracted parent trailing behind. But as I looked around, I realized there was no one. Just me and the balloon. It floated a few inches above the pavement, bobbing gently, like it was testing out its independence. I stopped walking, groceries in hand, and stared at it, half expecting it to turn around and wink at me. The balloon stopped too. We stood there, frozen in a weird little standoff. I don't know why I felt so invested in it. It was just a balloon, after all. But there was something deliberate about the way it moved, like it wasn't drifting randomly, like it knew where it was going. I took a cautious step forward. The balloon bounced once, then started floating away, slow but purposeful. And for reasons I still can't explain, I followed it. Now, let me be clear. I am not the kind of person who does this. I'm not whimsical or adventurous. If anything, I'm aggressively practical. But there was something oddly hypnotic about the balloon. Maybe it was the way it seemed so certain of itself, so confident in its direction. Or maybe I just wanted to see where it would lead me. The balloon floated down the street, its little string trailing along the ground. I trailed a few steps behind, feeling like I was in the world's weirdest fairy tale. It turned a corner, drifted past a coffee shop, then made its way into a quiet park. People glanced at me as I passed, probably wondering why this grown adult was stalking a balloon like it owed me money. I ignored them. The park was empty, except for a few benches and a swing set. The balloon slowed down, hovering near a cluster of trees, as if it was debating its next move. Then, it started to rise, higher and higher, until it was just a red speck against the gray clouds. "That's it," I muttered. "You're just leaving now?" But the balloon wasn't done with me yet. As it floated higher, something fell from it, a tiny white square, spinning in the air like a paper leaf. It landed a few feet in front of me, soft and silent on the grass. I looked up at the balloon, now a dot on the horizon, then back at the square. Slowly, I bent down to pick it up. It was a Polaroid photo. In the picture, there was a bench. The very same bench I was standing near, with the cluster of trees in the background. But in the photo, there was a man sitting on the bench. He wore a blue coat, a knit hat, and an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between a smile and a sigh. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking down at something in his hands, a small, red balloon. I flipped the photo over. On the back, in small, shaky handwriting, were the words, "Find him." Now, I know what you're thinking. This is the part where I call it quits, right? Where I say, nope, not getting involved in a mysterious scavenger hunt orchestrated by a rogue balloon, and go home to eat chips on my couch like a normal person. But I couldn't. Something about the photo pulled me in. Who was the man? Why did the balloon lead me here? And why did it feel like this was important? like I'd stumbled into a story that wasn't mine but needed me anyway. So, I stayed. I sat on the bench for hours, watching the trees sway in the breeze, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. By the time the sun started to set, I felt ridiculous. I'd spent the entire afternoon chasing a balloon and sitting in a park for no reason. I was about to leave when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw him. The man from the photo. Same blue coat, same knit hat, same half-smile, half-sigh expression. He was holding a coffee cup in one hand and a small bouquet of flowers in the other. He looked surprised to see me, like I was the one out of place. Hi, I said, standing awkwardly. Do you lose a balloon? He raised an eyebrow. A balloon? I held up the Polaroid. His eyes widened, and for a second, he just stared at it, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then, he laughed, a quiet, tired laugh that sounded like it had been trapped inside him for a long time. Where did you find this? He asked. I told him everything. The balloon, the park, the photo. He listened, nodding, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. When I finished, he shook his head. Well, he said, looks like she's still messing with me. Who? I asked. He hesitated, then held up the flowers. My wife, he said softly. She passed away last year. Red balloons were her thing. She used to leave them everywhere, on birthdays, anniversaries, just because. Said they were tiny pockets of joy. I guess she found a way to send one more. For a moment, we stood there in the golden light, quiet except for the rustling leaves. I didn't know what to say, so I just handed him the photo. He took it, his fingers brushing against mine, and nodded. Thank you, he said, for following it. And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the fading sunlight and a strange, bittersweet feeling in my chest. I don't know if it was fate or coincidence or just a really well-timed gust of wind, but that balloon found me for a reason. And now, whenever I see one floating by, I wonder, where is it going? Who is it for? And what tiny miracle might it be carrying with it? So, what about you? Ever had a moment so strange and perfect you couldn't explain it, but you felt it meant something anyway? The night I found the train, I wasn't looking for anything. It was the kind of night that felt hollow, when the silence in my apartment was too loud and the glow of my laptop screen seemed to press against my skull. Sleep wasn't coming, so I grabbed my coat and went for a walk. No destination, no plan. Just one foot in front of the other until the ache in my chest subsided. I'd walked the city streets 1,000 times before, so I don't know how I ended up at the old station. It had been shut down years ago, condemned for reasons no one ever really explained. People said it was haunted, but the kind of haunted that makes you roll your eyes, not cross yourself. And yet, that night, there it was, hidden between two buildings I swear hadn't been there the day before. The station's iron gate, rusted and bent, hung open like an invitation. I could have turned around. I could have gone home and watched another episode of something I'd forget by morning. But the night felt thin, like if I walked far enough, I might stumble into another world. And maybe I wanted to. The station was alive with echoes. My footsteps bounced off crumbling walls as I moved down the stairs, deeper into the dark. The air smelled of mildew and iron, thick and damp like the mouth of a cave. At the bottom of the steps, I found the platform. It stretched out into shadows, so long it seemed to vanish at the edges of my vision. A single lamp flickered above, casting pools of sickly yellow light onto the cracked tiles. And then I heard it, a distant hum, soft at first but growing louder, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. I turned toward the sound just as a train pulled into the station. It wasn't like any train I'd ever seen. Its body was sleek, black as oil, with windows that reflected nothing, not even the light. It came to a stop without a sound, and for a moment, nothing happened. The doors remained closed. The hum died away. The air held its breath. And then, with a hiss, the doors slid open. There was no one inside. The interior was lit with a dim blue glow that spilled out onto the platform like mist. I couldn't see the end of the car. It just stretched on forever, as if the train had swallowed the dark. A voice crackled over the station speakers, soft and tinny. as if it were speaking from the bottom of the ocean. Next stop, everywhere you've never been. I stepped onto the train. The doors slid shut behind me. The inside was stranger than the outside. It wasn't a train car, not really. It was a room, or maybe many rooms, stitched together in ways that didn't make sense. The floor was carpeted in something plush and dark, and the walls were lined with windows that didn't look out at anything, just swirls of shadow and light, like the universe itself was rushing past. The air smelled different in every step I took. Cinnamon, salt water, roses after a storm. I wandered deeper into the car, my footsteps muffled, and realized there were compartments, doors set into the walls, each one slightly different. The first had a brass handle shaped like a lion's head. The next, a round porthole window that seemed to blink when I looked at it too long. I hesitated at one door that stood out from the others. It was wooden, plain except for the number 17 carved into the center. Something about it made my chest tighten, like a memory I couldn't quite reach. Slowly, I turned the handle and stepped through. I was in my grandmother's kitchen, or at least, it looked like her kitchen. The yellow curtains, the chipped ceramic teapot, the smell of bread baking in the oven. It was all exactly as I remembered, down to the scuff marks on the floor where my chair had been. But the light outside the window was wrong. Too bright, too white, like someone had poured sunlight into a jar and shaken it. "Sit," a voice said. I turned to see her, my grandmother, standing by the stove. She was younger than I'd ever known her, her hair dark, her back straight, but her face wore that same kind smile. "Sit," she said again, and I did, sinking into the old wooden chair. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice breaking. "You." "I know," she said gently, pouring tea into a cup that hadn't been there a moment ago. "But it doesn't matter, does it? You wanted to see me." I stared at her, my throat tight. "What is this place?" She set the cup in front of me. The liquid inside was dark, swirling, the same shadows and lights I'd seen outside the train windows. "It's a ride," she said. "A way to visit what you've forgotten, what you've lost, what you're too afraid to find." I looked down at the tea. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and rippling, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone else looking up, someone who wore my face but didn't feel like me. "Drink," she said. I hesitated. "What happens if I do?" Her smile faltered, just a little. "You'll see what you need to see." "And if I don't?" The corners of her mouth tugged downward, and for the first time, she looked sad. "The train doesn't stop until you do." I picked up the cup. It was warm, heavy, the way something alive might feel in your hands. I took a sip. The world shattered. I saw myself at 7 years old, sitting alone on the swings at school. I saw my father's hands, trembling as he signed his name on a piece of paper he didn't want to sign. I saw a girl I'd loved once, her back to me as she walked away, disappearing into a crowd. Memory after memory flooded through me, moments I'd buried so deep I forgot they were mine. They poured through me like water through cracks in stone, and when it was over, I was back on the train. The door to the kitchen closed behind me. I stumbled down the car, gasping for breath, and the train began to move faster. The hum turned into a roar, the windows blurring as shadows and light bled together into nothing. I felt it pulling me forward, urging me deeper into the impossible compartments, the forgotten places. At the far end of the car, a final door waited. Unlike the others, it was plain. No carvings, no symbols, just a single word, written in shaky white paint. "Exit." I reached for it. The train screeched, the sound splitting through me like a knife, and for a moment, I thought the whole thing would tear apart. I yanked the door open and fell through. I woke up on the old station platform, the sound of rain pounding in my ears. The train was gone. The tracks were empty. I lay there for a long time, the night cold and damp around me, my body shaking like it was trying to remember how to belong to itself. When I finally got to my feet, I realized I was holding something. A small, black ticket. There were no words on it, just a single glowing line. "Good for one return trip." I don't know where the train comes from, or where it goes, but I know this. Some nights, when the air feels thin and the world feels close, I hear it in the distance. the hum of the engine, the screech of metal on tracks, and I know it's waiting for me.